It was the kind of flight that most people dream of. First class, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, plush leather seats, and the promise of a smooth journey across the country. Mark Thompson, a successful but somewhat arrogant businessman, was already reclining in his seat, sipping on his complimentary glass of champagne. He couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority over the other passengers in economy class. His life was a well-crafted performance. Power lunches, expensive cars, and a roster of luxury vacations that people could only dream about. But, for all his success, Mark was perpetually alone. It had become a point of pride for him that he didn't need anyone. Not a wife, not a close friend, just a growing empire and a business that could survive without him, if need be. As the flight attendants made their way down the aisle, Mark's eyes flicked to the man seated across from him. There, in the seat next to him, was Keanu Reeves. The actor who had shaped an entire generation with films like The Matrix and John Wick. Mark's eyes widened for a brief moment, but then he quickly caught himself, adjusting his posture, making sure he looked composed. He was a man who prided himself on controlling his reactions, even if it meant suppressing the excitement that bubbled inside him. After all, what was the point of meeting a celebrity when one was already someone important in their own right? Keanu was engrossed in his phone, typing something with his signature calmness. The world knew him as a humble, down-to-earth star, someone who had rejected the trappings of fame in favor of personal peace. But to Mark, he was just another person, another human being, unworthy of special treatment. There was no need to fawn over him, to act starstruck like those embarrassing fans. The seatbelt sign went off, and the flight attendants made their rounds, ensuring everyone was settled. As Mark adjusted his seat and settled in, he let out a soft chuckle. In his mind, Keanu wasn't anything extraordinary. Sure, he had a successful career, but he was just a man like anyone else. It was just the movies that made him appear larger than life. A thought began to form in Mark's mind. What would it be like to mess with him a little? Mark wasn't one to simply go unnoticed. He liked to control the room, to be the one others remembered. So, as the flight attendants passed by, he leaned toward Keanu, not to introduce himself, but to make a remark that would get his attention. "Hey, aren't you that guy from all those action movies? The one who just punches and shoots his way through everything?" Mark said with a half-smirk, a playful tone that he thought would be perceived as humorous. Keanu paused for a moment, raising an eyebrow and looking up slowly from his phone. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't anticipated that Keanu would even acknowledge him. But there was something in Keanu's eyes, something calm, yet unyielding. "You could say that," Keanu replied softly, his voice low and measured, as if he were speaking to a child who had just said something naive. Mark chuckled again, but this time, the sound felt hollow. "Right. I mean, it's pretty obvious that acting isn't all that tough, is it? Just a bunch of fight scenes and dramatic pauses," Mark continued, trying to keep the tone light. Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if Mark's words were insignificant. The silence between them grew uncomfortable. Mark could feel the air around him shift, but he refused to back down. He prided himself on his wit, and he wasn't about to let an actor, no matter how famous, get the best of him. After a moment, Keanu spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't think it's about fighting or dramatic pauses," he said. "It's about understanding the story, the people you're portraying. It's about truth." Mark blinked, surprised by the depth of the response. Truth? He wasn't expecting philosophy to come out of this conversation. He had expected Keanu to brush him off with a typical celebrity response, something that confirmed his belief that actors were all about their image. But instead, Keanu was giving him something more. Still, Mark wasn't about to let the actor get the last word. He leaned back in his chair, shifting uncomfortably, and smirked. "Yeah, sure, whatever you say. I still think your movies are a little overhyped." Keanu didn't react, but instead, he returned to his phone, giving Mark a clear signal that the conversation was over. It felt like a slap in the face, though. Mark had expected Keanu to be more defensive, to retaliate, but the lack of response left him feeling off balance. Mark wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to not getting the reaction he sought. The silence that followed was thick with tension, and it gnawed at him in a way that no high-powered meeting or negotiation ever could. But just as Mark was about to mutter another remark, Keanu looked up again. This time, there was no humor, no challenge, just a quiet, steady gaze. "You're right, though. It's easy to underestimate things from the outside. The world can be simple when you see it only from one perspective. But if you try to understand from another angle, you might just find that things aren't as simple as they seem." Mark froze. He didn't know what to say to that. The way Keanu spoke, with a sincerity that was almost too direct for someone like him, left Mark momentarily speechless. What is he talking about? Mark thought. But Keanu's words lingered in his mind like a riddle he couldn't solve. Maybe it was true. Maybe Mark had been too quick to judge the world, too quick to assert his superiority. Maybe he had just misjudged the man sitting next to him. But before he could say anything further, the plane began its descent. As the flight attendants made the final rounds, Mark looked over at Keanu, but the actor was already staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Mark sighed, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the empty aisle ahead. What just happened? He had no idea, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be the kind of encounter he'd expected. Mark Thompson wasn't a man who believed in coincidence. Everything in his life had been meticulously planned. From the business deals he closed to the cars he drove, every decision was a calculated move designed to maintain his place at the top. He had built his empire from the ground up, clawing his way through the ranks of the corporate world with a single-minded focus. His success wasn't due to luck. It was the result of years of ruthless determination. But despite all his achievements, Mark still felt a nagging emptiness. He had no one to share his success with, no one who truly understood the pressure and isolation that came with it. His friends were either business associates or acquaintances, people who admired his wealth and status, but never truly connected with him on a deeper level. As for his family, well, that relationship had been strained for years. His parents had always been proud of his accomplishments, but there was a lingering tension, an unspoken distance that neither side had ever addressed. Mark had a reputation for being difficult to approach, and that suited him just fine. People respected him because he didn't need anyone. He didn't care to be understood. He had learned long ago that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. And so, he built walls around himself. Walls made of work, wealth, and a carefully curated image of a man who had it all together. But in that first-class cabin, with its luxurious seats and high-end amenities, Mark found himself feeling a strange sense of unease. It wasn't just the proximity of a famous actor like Keanu Reeves, although that certainly didn't help. It was something deeper, something that had been bothering him for a while now. As the plane soared through the clouds, Mark thought back to the conversation he'd had with Keanu just moments before. The actor's calm, unruffled demeanor had thrown him off guard. Mark wasn't used to people who didn't react the way he expected. Most people, especially those in his world, were easily offended or eager to defend themselves when insulted. But Keanu had responded with quiet wisdom, almost as if he didn't care to engage in the petty back-and-forth that Mark was so used to. Mark's mind raced. What kind of person was he, really? He thought. He had spent so much time building his image, constructing a persona that others would admire and fear. But beneath it all, there was a question he had never asked himself. Why? He looked over at Keanu again, who was still staring out the window, his face serene and composed. Mark had read enough about the actor's life to know that he had never been one for the Hollywood spotlight. Keanu had always seemed different from other stars. He was known for his humility, his generosity, and his desire for privacy. People said he was kind to the people who worked for him, that he lived a modest life despite his immense fame. What was it like to live that way? Mark wondered. To be content with who you were, to not constantly feel the need to prove yourself to the world. It was a foreign concept to him, and yet something about it felt appealing. Mark shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. He wasn't used to feeling so disoriented. He liked to be in control. But there was something about Keanu, something in the way he carried himself, that made Mark question everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. Get a grip, Mark, he thought, shaking his head slightly. You're here to relax, not to have some midlife crisis on a plane. But despite his best efforts to push the thoughts aside, they lingered, gnawing at him. He had always measured his worth by the size of his bank account, the power he wielded in business, the admiration he received from those around him. But now, sitting next to Keanu, he began to wonder. Was that all there was? Was that really enough? He glanced at the actor again. Keanu's quiet confidence was almost magnetic. It wasn't about his fame. It wasn't about his wealth. It was the peace he seemed to radiate. A peace that Mark had never known. It was then that Mark realized something that both surprised and bothered him. He wanted that peace. He wanted to be like Keanu. But how could he? How could someone like him, who had spent so many years chasing validation and success, ever truly embrace that kind of peace? He wasn't even sure where to begin. The flight attendants passed by once more, their heels clicking softly on the floor as they made their way down the aisle. Mark caught the eye of one of them and waved for another glass of champagne. It was a distraction, a way to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He wasn't ready to confront the deeper issues he had been avoiding for so long. As the attendant poured his drink, Mark's eyes once again fell on Keanu. The actor had put his phone down and was now looking through the window, his face bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. He looked peaceful, almost as if the world had no power to disturb him. Mark envied that, more than he cared to admit. "Must be nice," Mark muttered under his breath, almost as if he were speaking to himself. He didn't expect Keanu to hear him, but the actor's head turned ever so slightly. He didn't speak, but his gaze met Mark's for a brief moment. It was a moment that felt like an eternity. In that look, Mark saw something that he hadn't expected. Understanding. A kind of silent acknowledgement that, deep down, Keanu knew exactly what Mark was feeling. The moment passed quickly, and Keanu returned to his quiet contemplation. But Mark was left with something that he couldn't shake. A sense that, perhaps, this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about Keanu's presence that felt purposeful, as if the universe had placed him right there, next to Mark, for a reason. Mark had spent his life building walls, perfecting his image, but now, for the first time, he felt something more than just the need to succeed. He felt a stirring, a longing to understand what it really meant to live a life that wasn't defined by wealth, power, or prestige. The question lingered in his mind as the plane continued its journey through the sky. What was it like to be truly free? And just like that, Mark Thompson's life had taken an unexpected turn. The remainder of the flight passed in a blur for Mark. His mind, once filled with thoughts of business meetings and the next big deal, was now consumed by the quiet encounter with Keanu. He had always believed that his life was in perfect order, that his drive and focus had placed him at the top for a reason. He had built everything around himself, his career, his reputation, his wealth. But now, sitting on this flight, next to a man who seemed to have it all without ever needing to prove it to anyone, Mark couldn't help but feel unsettled. Keanu had said so little, yet his presence spoke volumes. The actor's calm, self-assured demeanor was in stark contrast to the way Mark had lived his life, always rushing, always striving for more, never allowing himself a moment of peace. Mark had always told himself that he was happy. After all, he had everything he could ever want, the luxury, the power, the recognition. But now, for the first time in a long while, he questioned what happiness really meant. Was it something tangible, like a promotion or the perfect vacation? Or was it something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by bank accounts or stock portfolios? The plane began its descent, the steady hum of the engines growing louder as the altitude lowered. Mark glanced out the window, but his mind wasn't on the view. Instead, it was still. With Keanu, still reflecting on the way the actor had looked at him with such quiet understanding, as though he knew something about life that Mark had missed along the way. As the plane landed and the passengers began to prepare for disembarkation, Mark remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. He wasn't in a rush to leave. His thoughts were racing, and he needed a moment to collect himself. Keanu, on the other hand, stood up effortlessly, as though his mind was already elsewhere. With a calm nod to the flight attendants, he grabbed his bag and walked toward the exit. Mark watched him go, his heart still heavy with the questions that Keanu's words had stirred up. He He was snapped out of his thoughts when the flight attendant approached. "Sir, we're almost ready to deboard," she said with a polite smile. "Can I assist you with anything?" Mark straightened in his seat, offering a brief smile in return. "No, thank you," he replied, though he barely noticed her. His mind was elsewhere, still following the path that Keanu had set in motion. As he stood up and grabbed his own bag, he felt the weight of his success pressing down on him more than usual. The shiny suit, the designer shoes, the perfect watch. They suddenly felt like heavy armor, pieces of a life that, for the first time, didn't seem to fit him as well as it once had. The jet bridge stretched out in front of him, and Mark walked down it slowly, feeling the usual sense of confidence he had whenever he set foot on solid ground. But today, something was different. There was a subtle shift in the air around him, an invisible tension that he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions, to control situations, but now, he found himself questioning whether he was in control at all. As he entered the bustling terminal, Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from his assistant. "We need to discuss the upcoming board meeting. Some new developments." Mark felt a flash of irritation. He had just stepped off a long flight, and the last thing he wanted was to jump straight into work. But his fingers moved instinctively, tapping out a quick response. "Not now. I'll be home in an hour. Let's talk later." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking, trying to shake off the frustration. It was nothing new. His assistant was always pushing for his attention, always demanding more. But now, for the first time, Mark wondered why he was always so eager to comply. Why did he feel the need to constantly be available, constantly be in control? Was it for the sake of his company, or for his own sense of importance? The thought hung in the air as he moved through the terminal, and for a moment, he considered leaving the building and finding somewhere quiet to think. But he didn't have the luxury of time. He had a meeting to attend, and the world didn't stop just because he was feeling a little lost. As he reached the baggage claim area, Mark paused. He watched as other passengers retrieved their luggage from the carousel, some chatting with friends, others lost in their own thoughts. For the first time, he noticed how disconnected everyone seemed, how absorbed in their own worlds they were. He wondered how many of them were also carrying the weight of expectations, the pressure of pretending to have everything under control. How many of them, like him, had built lives full of achievements and success, only to feel a deep, unspoken emptiness beneath the surface. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his train of thought. This time, it was a call. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of a close business associate, Jason. "Mark, glad to see you're back. We need to discuss the merger proposal. It's moving fast, and we have some decisions to make." Jason's voice came through, crackling slightly on the other end. Mark didn't feel the usual surge of excitement at the mention of business. He didn't feel that familiar rush of adrenaline that came with securing another deal, another victory. Instead, he felt a sense of numbness. "Let's talk later, Jason," he said, his voice sounding more distant than he intended. "I'm going to need a bit of time." Jason didn't seem to notice the shift in Mark's tone. "Of course, no problem. Just let me know when you're ready to dive in. It's a big one." Mark hung up and stared at the baggage carousel, lost in thought. He knew what was coming next. Another series of meetings, another round of negotiations, another opportunity to prove himself. But this time, the idea didn't excite him. He didn't feel the rush that usually came with making deals, with winning. For the first time, Mark found himself asking, "Is this really all there is?" He grabbed his bag when it finally appeared on the carousel and made his way to the exit. The terminal was buzzing with activity, the noise of people rushing to their gates and the hum of announcements filling the air. But as he stepped into the busy parking lot, it all felt like background noise to the storm brewing in his mind. Keanu's words had cracked open something inside him, something he had kept buried for years. The realization that he might not have everything figured out, that his life might not be as perfect as he had always believed, was both unsettling and liberating. And now, as he stepped into his car and drove through the bustling city streets, Mark knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The drive from the airport to Mark's high-rise penthouse was usually a moment of solitude, a chance to decompress after the demands of business and travel. Normally, he would lose himself in thoughts of upcoming meetings, new deals, and the relentless pressure to stay ahead of the competition. But today, as he sat in the back of his chauffeured car, his mind refused to focus on anything but the conversation he had had with Keanu on the plane. The more he replayed their brief exchange, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. Something about the way Keanu spoke, the quiet strength he exuded, the way he seemed to glide through life without the need for constant validation. Mark had always prided himself on being a man of action, a man who built his life on achievements, but for the first time, he found himself wondering if all of it was really worth it. The car rolled smoothly through the city streets, the lights of downtown flickering like distant stars. Mark's phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his reverie. It was his assistant, once more. Your 3 p.m. meeting with the board is confirmed. They're waiting for your input on the budget revisions and the new project proposal. Do you want me to prepare any talking points? Mark stared at the message, feeling a slight annoyance simmer beneath the surface. More work, more decisions. He typed a quick reply. Cancel it. I'll handle it tomorrow. I need the rest of the day to clear my head. He sat back in his seat, staring out the window as the city unfolded around him. The skyscrapers, the people hustling through the streets, the endless movement of the world. It all felt like a blur. For the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. The usual rush to succeed, to climb higher, to be recognized, it all seemed pointless. As the car approached his building, Mark's thoughts turned inward. He had spent so much time and energy building his empire that he had never stopped to ask himself why. Why had he worked so hard to acquire wealth? To climb the corporate ladder? To achieve success that others would envy? Was it for the power? For the recognition? Or was it simply because he had never known how to do anything else? But as he thought about Keanu's quiet words, he realized something. None of that mattered to Keanu. The actor had never seemed to care about status or money or being the center of attention. He had rejected the very things Mark had built his life around. Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never known peace in his life. The drive to succeed had always been there, but he had never stopped to consider if that was truly what he wanted. Was there something more to life than what I've been chasing? The elevator ride up to his penthouse was quiet. Mark didn't speak to the doorman or the security staff as he entered the lobby. He was lost in his thoughts, unable to shake the questions that had been swirling in his mind ever since he sat next to Keanu. As he entered his apartment, the familiar luxury of his home surrounded him. The polished hardwood floors, the walls adorned with modern art, the sleek furniture that seemed to represent success at its peak. Yet, in this moment, it all felt cold and impersonal. The apartment, like everything else in his life, had been carefully designed, meticulously planned. But it lacked warmth. It lacked meaning. Mark walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a vast network of lights and buildings that seemed to pulse with energy. And yet, standing here, he felt disconnected. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, staring out into the night. What was it all for? The question lingered, and as much as he tried to push it away, it remained at the forefront of his mind. His entire life had been spent accumulating wealth, building his reputation, climbing higher. But now, the higher he climbed, the emptier it all seemed. Keanu's words had unsettled him, yes, but in a way that was starting to feel like a wake-up call. The actor had led a life outside the spotlight, finding contentment in the quieter moments, in the simplicity of human connection. What if Mark had been chasing the wrong things? What if all the success, all the accolades, had led him down the wrong path? He let out a deep breath, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. The man in the mirror was someone he had worked tirelessly to create, someone he had crafted to fit the image of success. But now, that image felt hollow. There was something more that he craved, something beyond the business deals and the luxury cars and the endless chase for power. Suddenly, Mark felt the urge to do something he hadn't done in years. Reach out to someone. Not a colleague, not a business associate, but someone who might offer him the kind of connection he had been missing. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a few names. Family members, old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in months, sometimes years. He hesitated, but then stopped on the name he hadn't expected to return to, Lily. Lily was an old friend from college, someone he had lost touch with when he began focusing exclusively on his career. She had been different from the others, warm, compassionate, unafraid to challenge him when he needed it most. Back then, she had been the one person who had seen beyond his ambition and recognized his vulnerabilities. They had drifted apart when Mark's life became consumed with work, but something about her name felt like the lifeline he needed right now. He hadn't spoken to her in years, but in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might just be the person he needed to reconnect with. With a sigh, he hit the call button. The phone rang, and then, after a few moments, a voice picked up on the other end. Hello? Mark's heart skipped a beat. It had been so long. Lily, it's Mark. I know it's been a while, but I need to talk. There was a pause, and then a soft, warm laugh. Mark Thompson? I thought you disappeared off the face of the earth. It's been way too long. What's going on? Mark took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to start somewhere. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and, to be honest, I think I've been running from, well, everything. Lily's voice softened. Running from what? Mark didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, he felt the desire to find them. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I just need to figure out what I'm really after. Lily didn't say anything right away, but Mark could hear the understanding in her silence. I think we all need a little time to figure that out, she finally said. But you're not alone in that, Mark. You never were. As Mark sat down in his living room, the weight of the city still pressing against the windows, he realized something important. He was finally ready to stop pretending he had all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, reconnecting with the things that truly mattered could give him the clarity he had been seeking for so long. Mark sat in his penthouse, the silence around him feeling heavier than usual. After his phone call with Lily, he hadn't known what to do with himself. The conversation had been brief, but it had sparked something inside him, a recognition that perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind his success and face the truth. He had been running for so long, distracting himself with work and the pursuit of status, that he hadn't realized how much he had lost in the process. Lily had always had a way of seeing through his facade, of calling him out when he needed it most. She wasn't afraid to challenge him, and that was something Mark had always admired. But it had also been something he pushed away. He wasn't ready to hear the hard truths. He wasn't ready to confront the reality that his life might be empty despite all the wealth and power he had accumulated. But now, he felt different. The conversation had planted a seed in his mind, one that he couldn't shake. What was he really looking for? The clock on the wall ticked away, the seconds feeling longer than usual. Mark walked over to the large windows, staring out over the city below. The view that had once filled him with pride now seemed distant and cold. The buildings, the cars, the people, all of it felt like a stage, and he was an actor playing his part, but no longer sure of the script. His phone buzzed again, breaking him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Jason, his business associate. I know you said you needed time, but the board is getting antsy. We need your input. Can we set something up for tomorrow? Mark stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the keys. Normally, he would have jumped at the chance to deal with business, solve problems, close deals, assert his dominance. But now, the words felt like a weight. He put the phone down without responding. For the next few minutes, Mark stood there, staring at the text, grappling with the pressure that was mounting in his chest. He had built a life that revolved around these decisions, this constant race to stay on top. But now, he wasn't so sure that it was what he truly wanted. He had been so focused on climbing the ladder, he hadn't realized the toll it was taking on his soul. The weight of it all was suffocating. He picked up his phone again and, before he could overthink it, dialed Lily's number. He needed to hear her voice again. Maybe, just maybe, she could help him make sense of everything that was swirling inside him. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Mark, hey, you okay? Mark's chest tightened at the sound of her voice. I don't know, he said honestly. his words coming out in a rush. I don't know what I'm doing, Lily. I've spent my entire life building this empire. But now, I don't even know what I'm building it for. It's like I'm on autopilot, just going through the motions, trying to achieve more without ever stopping to ask why. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lily's voice softened, filled with understanding. Mark, you're not alone in feeling this way. So many people get trapped in the same cycle, chasing success, thinking that it'll bring happiness, only to realize it's empty. But the fact that you're asking these questions means something. It means you're ready for a change. Mark closed his eyes and let out a deep breath. I don't know where to start. I've spent so much time building a life around what I should want. Now, I'm not sure what I actually want. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, maybe it's time for you to stop running. Stop running from the hard questions. Stop running from yourself. The things that really matter, love, connection, peace, they're not things that can be bought or achieved. They're things you have to create. Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he couldn't fully explain why. It wasn't as if her words were new. He had heard all the cliches about finding happiness within, about slowing down and appreciating the simple things. But with Lily, it was different. She spoke from a place of authenticity, a place where the world wasn't just a game to be won. It was a journey to be experienced. I don't know if I can just stop, Lily, Mark admitted, his voice full of uncertainty. I don't even know what it would look like to live differently. That's okay, she said, a smile in her voice. You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about taking the first step. You don't have to change your whole life overnight. Just ask yourself what really matters to you. Then take one step in that direction. That's how you start. Mark stared out the window, the city lights flickering below like 1,000 tiny stars. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to be in control of everything. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to start somewhere. I think you're right, Mark said quietly. I've been running for so long that I've forgotten how to live. Maybe it's time I figured that out. Lily's voice was warm and encouraging. You'll get there. It's not about perfection, Mark. It's about progress. And it's about being true to yourself. There was a long pause as Mark let her words settle into him. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this wasn't the end of his journey. Maybe it was just a new beginning. Thank you, Lily, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. I needed to hear that. You don't have to thank me. Just take it one step at a time. And remember, life's not about the destination. It's about the journey. As they hung up, Mark sat back down, his mind buzzing with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He was no longer chasing something outside of himself. He wasn't looking to prove anything to anyone. It was time to stop running and start living. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt ready to face whatever came next. As the night stretched on, Mark decided to take a different kind of step. He reached for his phone, opened his calendar, and canceled the upcoming meetings. He wasn't going to focus on business for the next few days. He needed time. Time to rediscover what truly mattered. Time to reconnect with the things that he had lost sight of in the pursuit of success. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally find the peace that Keanu had shown him on that plane. The next few days were a blur of quiet moments and reflection for Mark. After his phone call with Lily, he had taken the first step he needed, a pause. He had canceled all of his meetings, pushed aside work, and allowed himself to simply be. No frantic phone calls, no scrambling to meet deadlines, no chasing after the next deal. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had nothing on his plate but time. It was uncomfortable at first. Mark had always been a man of action. Every day was a carefully orchestrated ballet of work and obligations, and now, without that structure, he felt a sense of unease gnawing at him. But as the hours stretched on, he began to find a certain peace in the quiet. At night, he walked around his penthouse, gazing out at the twinkling lights of the city below. For the first time, he allowed himself to think, to let his mind wander, without immediately filling it with distractions. He thought about his childhood, about the early days of his career, about the people he had left behind in his race to the top. He thought about Keanu. In the quiet of his apartment, the actor's calm demeanor seemed more profound. Mark hadn't been able to stop replaying their interaction on the plane. Keanu's simplicity had been disarming, and in retrospect, Mark realized that he had misunderstood the source of his discomfort. It wasn't just that Keanu had said so little. It was that he seemed to be living a life in complete alignment with who he truly was, something Mark had never done. As he stood by the windows that looked out over the city, Mark felt a strange pull. It wasn't the desire to climb higher or achieve more. It wasn't about the business deals or the next big success. It was about finding something more meaningful, something deeper. He remembered Lily's words. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about taking the first step. Mark took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to take another step forward in this strange, uncharted territory. The next morning, he decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He went for a run. The idea had come to him as he sat in the living room, looking out at the city. He had always enjoyed running when he was younger, back before the pressure of his career had consumed him. The exercise had given him a sense of release, a moment to clear his head, a chance to reconnect with his body and his surroundings. He pulled on a pair of sneakers, an old t-shirt, and a pair of shorts he hadn't worn in years. Stepping outside, he felt a small thrill as the cool morning air hit his skin. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet and empty, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. He started at a slow pace, his breath coming easily as his legs carried him down the familiar streets of his neighborhood. He passed the usual buildings, the luxury condos, the trendy cafes, the high-end shops, but today, they didn't seem so important. His mind wasn't focused on what he was passing or where he was going. It was simply focused on the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement, the feeling of his lungs expanding with each breath. As he ran, Mark allowed his mind to wander again. This time, it was different. Instead of rushing to fill every thought with something productive, he let his mind sit with the questions that had been lingering over him. What do I truly want? What would my life look like if I let go of the constant chase? He realized he hadn't given himself permission to explore those questions before. In his pursuit of success, he had been so focused on outward achievements that he had forgotten the most important part of the journey, the inner one. The one that asked, "Who am I?" Really? The run was both physically invigorating and mentally grounding. When he returned to his penthouse, he was sweaty and out of breath, but there was a sense of clarity that had come with the movement. He sat on the edge of his couch and took a long drink of water, feeling a sense of accomplishment. But it wasn't the kind of accomplishment he had been used to. It wasn't about winning, closing deals, or gaining recognition. This was different. This was about rediscovering his own sense of purpose, finding his footing again in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. After showering and grabbing a light breakfast, Mark sat at his kitchen table, still processing his thoughts. He had time now, time to explore these questions without the pressure of meetings or deadlines. He could take his time figuring out what mattered most. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his reverie. It was Jason, his business associate. "Are you ready to talk about the merger proposal yet? We need your approval on the final numbers." Mark stared at the text, the familiar pull of work tugging at him. The old Mark would have jumped on it immediately, eager to be the one with the answers, to assert control over the situation. But today, the urge wasn't there. Instead, he felt a wave of indifference. He typed a response, "Not today, Jason. We'll talk later. I'm taking some time to figure things out." He put the phone down, feeling a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't that he was abandoning his responsibilities. He knew there would be time for that later. But right now, he was focused on something different. He needed to figure out who he was outside of the world of business. He needed to reconnect with the parts of himself that had been overshadowed by ambition and pressure. Mark spent the rest of the morning in a quiet solitude, reading books on philosophy and personal development, journaling about his thoughts and feelings, and reflecting on his childhood. There were moments when he felt a pang of anxiety, the familiar nagging thought that he was wasting time, that he should be doing more, achieving more. But he reminded himself that this was exactly the reason he had needed to stop, to create space for the thoughts he had been avoiding. By midday, Mark felt a growing sense of peace. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change, but a subtle shift. He was beginning to understand that life wasn't just about success or status. It was about balance, about finding moments of stillness amid the chaos. Later that afternoon, Mark made a decision. He was going to take a break from the high-pressure world of corporate life, at least for a while. He was going to explore the things he had neglected, the things that brought him joy before the hustle of work had consumed him. It wasn't about abandoning his career, but about finding a healthier relationship with it. And maybe, just maybe, he would start to build a life that felt a little more like his own. Mark woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long seemed to have lifted overnight, leaving behind a sense of peace he didn't quite understand but was grateful for. It was like a weight had been removed from his shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free to breathe, to think, to live. He spent the morning reading, slowly making his way through books on philosophy, mindfulness, and self-discovery. Each page seemed to offer a new perspective, a new way of seeing the world that challenged everything he had previously believed. The old Mark, the one who had been obsessed with success and climbing the corporate ladder, would have dismissed these books as distractions. But today, each idea seemed to resonate with him on a deeper level. By noon, Mark had come to a decision. He wasn't going to abandon everything he had worked for, but he was going to start living differently. It was time to stop measuring his worth by his wealth and status and start finding value in the things that truly mattered: his relationships, his personal growth, and his happiness. But how would he begin? The answer came to him unexpectedly. He remembered the conversation he had had with Keanu on the plane, the way the actor had seemed so at peace with himself, so comfortable in his own skin. Keanu hadn't been consumed by the pursuit of success, but instead had embraced a life of authenticity, of choosing what brought him fulfillment over what brought him recognition. Mark found himself wanting to learn more about that kind of life. A life that wasn't defined by the number of zeros on his paycheck or the power he held in the boardroom. But it wasn't just about wanting to be like Keanu. It was about wanting to find his own path, one that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others. His phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. It was Jason, once more. "Mark, we really need to finalize the merger documents today. Can we schedule a meeting?" The clock's ticking. Mark stared at the message for a moment, his fingers hovering over the screen. He thought about the urgency in Jason's words, the pressure that was always building, always looming over him. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had been addicted to the thrill of closing deals, making decisions, and climbing higher and higher. Instead of responding to Jason right away, Mark closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and made a choice. Today wasn't for business. Today was for something else. He replied to Jason with a simple message: "We'll handle it next week. I'm taking a day to reflect and recharge. Thanks for understanding." He placed the phone down, feeling the weight of that decision settle comfortably in his chest. It was a small step, but it was a step towards something bigger, a life that wasn't dominated by the pressure to perform. With the rest of the day ahead of him, Mark decided to take a walk in the park. It was something he hadn't done in years, something so simple and yet so grounding. He needed to reconnect with the world outside the bubble he had created for himself, to remind himself that there was more to life than work and ambition. The weather was perfect. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow over the green spaces as people walked their dogs, jogged along the paths, and sat on benches reading books or chatting with friends. Mark breathed in the fresh air, the sound of birds chirping and children laughing filling the space around him. As he walked, he noticed things he had never seen before. The way the leaves rustled in the wind, the laughter of a child chasing after a ball, the smile on an elderly woman's face as she watched the world go by. All of these small, fleeting moments felt significant now. They reminded him that there was beauty in simplicity, that there was more to life than the endless cycle of work, success, and achievement. Mark found a quiet bench by the lake and sat down, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. He let the stillness wash over him, feeling his mind slow down and settle. For the first time, he felt at ease in the present moment, without the need to rush or plan. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts again, and stopped on Lily's name. He hadn't spoken to her since their last conversation, and today felt like the right time to reach out. He tapped on her number and waited for her to pick up. It only rang once before Lily's voice came through, warm and familiar. "Mark? How's everything going?" "I'm good," Mark said, his voice sounding lighter than it had in weeks. "Actually, I'm better than good. I think I'm finally starting to get it. What you've been talking about all along." There was a smile in Lily's voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been living my life for the wrong reasons. I've been so focused on climbing, on building this empire, that I lost sight of what actually makes me happy. But today, I finally gave myself permission to just be for a while. I took a walk in the park, I read, I reflected, and I realized that there's more to life than chasing success. It's about finding meaning, finding peace, and reconnecting with what really matters." Lily's voice softened, the joy in her tone evident. "I'm really proud of you, Mark. It sounds like you're on the right track. But remember, it's not about finding the answers all at once. It's about allowing yourself to grow, to change, and to embrace the journey. You don't have to have everything figured out today." "I know," Mark replied, smiling to himself. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path." They chatted for a few more minutes, sharing stories about their own journeys and the changes they had gone through. It felt good to talk to someone who understood, someone who didn't just see the business success but saw the person behind it. Lily had always been a reminder that there was more to life than the image he had created. As Mark hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't about abandoning his career or rejecting success. It was about finding a balance, a way to live with intention, to prioritize the things that brought him joy, and to build a life that felt authentic to who he truly was. Mark stood up from the bench, ready to take the next step. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt prepared to face it with an open heart and a clear mind. And whatever came next, he knew it would be different. This was just the beginning. Mark had always prided himself on his ability to control his schedule, to meticulously plan every day down to the last minute. But in the days since he'd taken a step back from the constant race of corporate life, he was learning to embrace the unexpected, and it felt strangely liberating. The unplanned moments, the unstructured hours, were where he was finding the most clarity. It was a Saturday morning when he decided to take a break from his usual routine and visit a local coffee shop. The weather was perfect, and he had noticed a new cafe that had opened just a few blocks from his apartment. He wasn't sure why, but something about the place drew him in. He wanted to see what it felt like to sit somewhere unfamiliar, in the midst of people going about their day, and just observe. As he walked down the street, he noticed the small, rustic cafe, tucked away between two high-rise buildings. Its windows were fogged up with steam, the smell of fresh coffee wafting out as he approached. There was a handwritten sign that read, "The Good Bean, Coffee, Conversation, and Connection." Mark chuckled to himself. It sounded like the kind of place that marketed itself as a community hub, but he was curious nonetheless. Walking inside, he was immediately struck by the cozy atmosphere. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and the warm, inviting scent of coffee filled the air. The barista behind the counter gave him a friendly nod as he approached. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her smile genuine, as if serving coffee was the most enjoyable thing in the world. Mark looked at the menu and hesitated. His usual go-to was always a simple black coffee, but today, for some reason, he felt like trying something different. "I'll have a latte, please," he said, surprising himself. He had always stuck to what he knew, but today felt like a good day for something new. The barista's smile grew wider. "Coming right up." As he waited, Mark glanced around the cafe. The tables were filled with people, some working on laptops, others engaged in quiet conversations, and a few reading books. There was an energy in the space that was calming yet vibrant, a balance of productivity and relaxation that Mark found intriguing. He realized he hadn't spent much time in places like this, surrounded by people simply enjoying their day without any rush or pressure. His coffee arrived in a few minutes, and he took a sip, savoring the smooth, rich taste. He found an empty seat near the window, overlooking the busy street outside. As he sat there, watching people walk by, something unexpected happened. Someone sat down across from him. Mark looked up, startled. The man who had joined him at the table was older than Mark by at least a decade, with a full beard and a kind, weathered face. He was wearing a well-worn jacket and jeans, his eyes sparkling with a warmth that immediately put Mark at ease. "I hope you don't mind me sitting here," the man said with a friendly tone. "The place is a bit crowded today, and I've been eyeing this table. Seems like the perfect spot to enjoy a coffee." Mark blinked, a little taken aback by the sudden appearance of this stranger. Normally, he would have avoided small talk, preferring the isolation of his thoughts or a business meeting to the randomness of a cafe encounter. But today, something in him felt open to this interaction. "No, not at all," he replied, offering a small smile. "It's a good spot." The man nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I don't mean to intrude, but I've been coming here for years. It's one of those places that makes you feel like you're part of something, you know? Like the world outside doesn't exist for a while." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Yeah, I can see that. I've been here once before, just wanted to try something different." "I get that," the man said with a chuckle. "Sometimes, all we need is a change of scenery. Helps us see things in a new light. But, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you here today? You don't look like the type who usually has the time for a coffee shop visit." Mark hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to being asked personal questions by strangers, especially not in such an open, unguarded way. But then again, there was something about this man's presence that felt safe. Something unassuming, yet deeply perceptive. For reasons he couldn't explain, Mark felt compelled to answer honestly. "I guess I'm figuring things out," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been working for so long, chasing success, but I realized it's not really fulfilling me anymore. So, I've been taking a break, trying to figure out what I really want." The man nodded slowly, as if he had heard this story before. "It's funny how life works that way, isn't it?" he said. "We spend all this time chasing something, thinking it's the answer. But sometimes it's the pause, the stopping, that gives us the clarity we need." Mark felt a strange sense of connection to the man's words. It was as if he understood exactly what Mark was going through. "Yeah, that's exactly how I feel," Mark said, his voice softer now. "I've been so focused on achieving and climbing the ladder that I forgot to stop and actually look around." The man smiled, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "You know, I used to be just like you. Always busy, always moving, always doing. But one day, I just stopped. It was like I woke up and realized I'd been living someone else's version of success. The day I let go of that need to prove something was the day my life really began." Mark felt a pang of recognition. It was as if the man had just articulated what had been swirling in his own mind. "How did you do it? How did you let go?" The man chuckled, a deep, knowing laugh. "It wasn't easy, but I found that the more I stopped trying to control everything, the more things began to fall into place. I let go of the constant pressure, the expectations, both from others and from myself. I stopped running." Mark listened intently, feeling a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "That sounds freeing." "It is," the man said simply. "But you have to be willing to trust that there's more to life than what you've been taught to pursue. And that's the hardest part, letting go of the idea that success is something you can measure." They both sat in silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee. The world outside continued to bustle, but in that small cafe, time seemed to slow down. Mark found himself reflecting on everything this man had shared. His words echoed in his mind, like a quiet reminder that it was okay to stop, to pause, to let life unfold at its own pace. Eventually, the man stood up, ready to leave. "I'll let you get back to your coffee," he said with a smile. "But remember, sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing at all. Let the answers come to you." Mark nodded, a feeling of gratitude swelling within him. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." The man gave him a knowing look. "I think you'll be just fine. Take care, my friend." As the man left the cafe, Mark felt a deep sense of connection to the moment, as if this unexpected encounter had been exactly what he needed. Sometimes, the most important lessons came from the people you least expected, in the places you least expected them. Mark sat back in his chair, the warmth of the coffee cup in his hands, feeling the weight of the past few days finally starting to settle into something lighter. He wasn't sure where his journey would take him next, but one thing was certain. He was no longer in a rush to find the answers. For the first time in a long time, he was content with simply being present. Mark awoke to the soft rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds, gently pulling him from his sleep. He hadn't woken up this relaxed in years. No urgent calls, no meetings to rush to, no deadlines looming overhead. It was just him, the quiet morning, and the space to breathe. But the serenity of the morning didn't last long. As the day unfolded, a nagging feeling began to settle in his chest. It wasn't the familiar stress of work demanding his attention, nor the pressure to be constantly productive. It was something deeper, something unsettling. The conversation from the coffee shop replayed in his mind. The old man's words had stuck with him, echoing in his thoughts like a riddle. Let go of the need to control everything. Success isn't something you can measure. He couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had been based on a set of rules he hadn't even chosen. Rules about success, achievement, and the relentless pursuit of more. It was as if the choices he had made were never truly his own, but rather a response to an invisible pressure to fit in, to prove something. He knew it was time to confront that pressure, to ask himself some hard questions. What do I really want? Am I living the life I actually want to live? Mark stood up, pacing the apartment as he thought. He was overwhelmed by the weight of those questions. Every decision he had made in the past seemed to be based on the fear of losing something, his status, his wealth, his place in the world. But now, as he looked at his life from a new perspective, he began to wonder if there was more to it than just holding on to what he had. His phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Lily. "How's your weekend going? Have you had a chance to relax yet?" Mark smiled at the text. He had always appreciated Lily's gentle way of checking in on him, especially when he needed it the most. Her support had become a lifeline during this confusing period in his life. He typed back quickly. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot. I feel like there's something I'm missing, but I'm not sure what it is yet." Lily's reply came almost immediately. "I know exactly what you mean, but you can't rush the process. It's okay to not have all the answers right now. The important thing is that you're asking the right questions." That's a huge step. Mark read the message and let out a long breath. It was true. He didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. But as the days passed, he found that the act of questioning, of pausing, and reflecting was already changing him. He felt like he was peeling back layers of himself he hadn't known existed. But the deeper he went, the more he realized just how much he had to confront. Who am I really, without all the titles and achievements? The question lingered in his mind as he sat down at his kitchen table. He grabbed a notebook and a pen and began writing. He wrote about his childhood dreams, about the things that used to excite him before he became consumed by his career. He wrote about his fears, the things he was afraid of losing, and how much of his life had been driven by those fears rather than by what he truly wanted. As he wrote, something inside him shifted. It was like the walls he had built up around himself were slowly starting to crumble. For the first time, he wasn't trying to make himself into something. He wasn't trying to chase success or be someone he thought he should be. He was simply trying to understand who he really was. The afternoon passed in a haze of self-reflection. Mark didn't feel the need to rush. He wasn't answering emails or planning his next big move. He was sitting with his thoughts, allowing them to unfold naturally. It felt uncomfortable at times, but also incredibly freeing. When evening came, Mark found himself once again at the coffee shop. He didn't know why he had come back. Maybe it was the comforting atmosphere or the need for a change of scenery. But as he walked through the door, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't expected. To his surprise, the same older man from the other day was sitting at the same table, a cup of coffee in front of him, deep in thought. He looked up when Mark entered, his face lighting up in recognition. "Ah, it's you again," the man said with a smile. "I'm glad you came back." Mark returned the smile, feeling strangely at ease. "Yeah, I guess there's something about this place. It's peaceful." The man nodded knowingly. It has a way of helping people think. Sometimes, a quiet space is all we need to hear ourselves clearly. Mark sat down across from him, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The conversation from the other day seemed to linger in the air between them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mark began. "About letting go of control, about not measuring success the way I've always done." The man's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "And what did you discover?" Mark exhaled slowly, a mixture of frustration and relief in his voice. "I don't know who I am without all the titles and the constant striving. I feel like I've been living a life that was never truly mine. I've been chasing something, success, achievement, but I don't even know if it's what I really want. I feel like I've spent so much of my life making decisions based on fear, and now I'm just lost." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a deep empathy in his gaze. "It's normal to feel that way," he said quietly. "When you've spent so much time living for others, it can be hard to hear your own voice again. But the beauty of it is that you have the power to change that. You have the power to choose what matters most to you, not what others expect of you." Mark looked down at his hands, realizing how true those words were. He had been so focused on making the right choices for so long. Choices that would lead to more money, more success, more status. But in doing so, he had ignored the most important part of the equation: his own happiness, his own sense of fulfillment. "How do I even begin?" he asked quietly. "How do I start making choices for me, not for everyone else?" The man smiled gently. "You start by being kind to yourself. You start by allowing yourself to ask questions, even if you don't have all the answers. And most importantly, you stop rushing. The journey will take time, but every step forward is a step toward finding your true path." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing the man's words. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it wasn't about finding a quick fix or a perfect answer. Maybe it was about embracing the uncertainty, the messy, unpredictable nature of life, and trusting that, in time, he would find his way. As he sat there in the cafe, the weight of the questions still pressing on his mind, he realized something important. This was just the beginning. The road to self-discovery wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and it was one he was finally ready to take. It had been a few weeks since Mark had first stepped foot into the coffee shop, and each visit had brought him closer to understanding himself. His mornings, once consumed by the frantic rhythm of work and deadlines, were now filled with moments of quiet introspection. Yet, even with all the progress, there was still something Mark felt was missing. He had the time, the space, and the desire to change, but he hadn't yet found the courage to make the shift. Something still held him back, an invisible thread pulling him back to his old habits. Mark sat on his couch one evening, the faint hum of the city just beyond his window. He had just returned from another quiet day at the cafe, where he had spent the afternoon journaling and reflecting on his journey. As he looked around his apartment, everything felt oddly disconnected, as if the space was a shell that no longer matched who he was becoming. It was almost as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was fine when, deep down, he knew it wasn't. A loud knock on his door broke his train of thought. "Mark!" Lily's voice called out from the other side. "Open up, it's me." Mark couldn't help but grin. Lily had a way of showing up unannounced, always with a smile and a new perspective. He walked over to the door and opened it to find her standing there, her eyes sparkling with energy, as if she had just come from some grand adventure. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. "Thought I'd check in and see how you're doing." Mark couldn't help but laugh. "I'm glad you're here. I've been in my head all day. But you know, I'm not sure I'm any closer to figuring things out." Lily raised an eyebrow. "That's what you think. But let's be real. You've made huge progress. You're asking the right questions now. And that's everything. The fact that you're giving yourself the space to reflect, that's the hardest part." Mark sighed, sitting down on the couch. "I don't know. It feels like I'm stuck. Like I'm just going through the motions without really knowing where I'm headed. Everyone around me keeps moving forward, but I'm still here, trying to figure it out." Lily sat beside him, her presence calm but grounded. "You're not stuck. You're just not rushing. And that's exactly what you need. You've spent your whole life moving at 100 miles an hour, trying to meet deadlines and make the next big leap. Maybe now is the time to slow down, to let things unfold naturally. Mark ran a hand through his hair. But what if I'm missing out? What if everyone else is advancing and I'm falling behind? You're not falling behind, Lily said, her voice firm but kind. You're just on a different timeline. You're figuring out what truly matters, instead of just going along with the expectations. There's no timeline for self-discovery, Mark. You're doing it in your own way, in your own time. And that's something worth celebrating. For the first time in a while, Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. The constant pressure to keep up, to always be ahead, had been exhausting. He had been so consumed with the idea of success that he forgot to pause and question what success truly meant to him. I just don't know what I want, Mark admitted, his voice quiet. I've spent so much time chasing other people's definitions of success that I've lost sight of what matters to me. Lily nodded, her eyes full of understanding. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Figuring out what you actually want, not what others tell you to want. But I believe you'll find it. You don't have to have all the answers today. The fact that you're questioning it all shows you're already on the right path. Mark took a deep breath. Maybe I need to make some changes. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I think it's time. I've been too comfortable for too long. Lily smiled. Good. Change is scary, but it's also liberating. And you've already taken the first step. You're asking the right questions. The next step is figuring out what you really want, and that's going to come with time. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. Mark leaned back against the couch, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He didn't have to have everything figured out right now. He had spent so many years thinking that he needed to have all the answers, that the right answers would make him whole. But now, he realized that there was beauty in the uncertainty, in the unfolding of life. I think I'm finally starting to understand, Mark said slowly. I don't have to rush into anything. I don't have to have it all figured out. I just need to take the next step, however small it might be. Lily grinned, nudging him playfully. That's the spirit. You're doing it, Mark. You're learning how to trust yourself, and that's more important than any external success. Mark smiled, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from chasing after something external. It was a deeper, quieter hope that came from trusting in himself, from knowing that the answers would come when the time was right. The evening passed in a comfortable silence, the two of them chatting about life, relationships, and everything in between. Mark didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. He was learning to embrace the unknown, to sit with the discomfort, and to trust that he was moving in the right direction, even if it didn't look like anything he had planned. As Lily stood to leave, she gave him a quick hug. I'm proud of you, Mark. You're on the right path. Thanks, Lily, he said, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. I think I'm starting to believe that too. When she left, Mark sat on the couch, reflecting on everything that had been said. His mind was no longer racing with anxiety or doubt. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a sense of peace that he hadn't known for years. It was true. He didn't have all the answers. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the journey itself was the answer. As he sat there, he made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to explore, to ask the tough questions, and to trust that he was exactly where he needed to be. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt truly awake. Mark had spent the following week in a kind of daze, not in a bad way, but in a way that felt as if his mind and heart were catching up to one another. The conversations with Lily, the reflections from his time in the coffee shop, and even the unexpected advice from the older man were all swirling inside him like a puzzle, pieces that needed time to fall into place. He hadn't yet taken any drastic steps, but the wheels were turning, and for the first time in years, it felt okay to not have everything mapped out. This morning was different. As Mark sat in his kitchen, drinking his coffee, he made a decision. He was going to take a step, a small one, but it was going to be his. The thought of change still sent a ripple of nervous energy through his chest, but it also felt exciting, freeing. It was time to make a change, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He was done living for other people's expectations, done trying to fit into a mold that was never his to begin with. He glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 a.m., too early for his usual routine. Today, however, felt different. It felt like the perfect moment to do something that had been tugging at his conscience for a while. Mark grabbed his phone and opened his calendar. He scrolled down to the weekend, where an empty block awaited him. His finger hovered over the screen. For a split second, he hesitated, second-guessing himself. What if I'm making a mistake? But the thought passed just as quickly. He was used to overthinking, used to waiting for the right moment that never seemed to come. Today, he realized, there would never be a perfect moment. It was all about making the decision and trusting that the rest would follow. He tapped the screen and, without overthinking, booked a flight to a small town in the mountains. It wasn't a luxurious vacation. In fact, it was more of a retreat. A few days away to disconnect, think, and get some perspective. Something about it felt right. He had always been so tethered to the city, to work, to the relentless noise of modern life. The idea of going somewhere quiet, isolated, was incredibly appealing. It was a space where he could finally be still, away from distractions. The instant he hit confirm, a wave of relief washed over him. It wasn't just the flight. It was the realization that he was taking control, that he was making a choice for himself. It was the first step on a path he didn't yet fully understand, but the act of stepping forward felt liberating in a way he hadn't expected. He sent a quick text to Lily. Booked a flight to a small town up in the mountains for the weekend. I think I'm finally doing it, taking a break, clearing my head. I'll let you know how it goes. Her reply came swiftly, as always. That sounds amazing. I'm so proud of you for doing this. You've got this. And remember, it's not about having it all figured out right away. It's about giving yourself the space to figure it out. Mark smiled as he read her words. She was right. It wasn't about rushing to find answers. It was about creating the space to breathe and trust that the answers would eventually come. He was stepping into the unknown, but that was okay. In fact, it felt necessary. As he packed his bag later that afternoon, Mark's thoughts wandered to what lay ahead. What would this weekend bring? What would he discover about himself, about his life? He wasn't sure, but the uncertainty didn't feel as frightening anymore. The idea of being away, surrounded by nature, with nothing to distract him but his own thoughts, was strangely comforting. Maybe, just maybe, he would find clarity there. He arrived at the airport later that evening, a little nervous but excited. It was a small regional airport, quiet compared to the bustling chaos of the bigger terminals. As he made his way through security and toward his gate, he found himself looking around at the other travelers, some in a hurry, others moving slowly, lost in their own thoughts. He was struck by how everyone was on their own journey, each one carrying their own burdens, their own dreams. In a strange way, it made him feel less alone. We were all just trying to find our way. The flight was short, and soon enough, he was landing in the small town nestled between the mountains. It felt worlds apart from the city he had come from. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that made you feel awake, like it could shake off the weight of years of stress and anxiety. The landscape stretched out before him, vast and green, with the mountains towering in the distance. It was the kind of place that made you realize how small your problems were in the grand scheme of things. There was something humbling about it, and something grounding, too. He checked into his small hotel, a cozy place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The front desk attendant, a woman with a warm smile, handed him a key and gave him directions to a nearby hiking trail. Mark didn't have any specific plans. He was here to listen, to reflect, to let the quiet of the mountains do its work on him. After dropping off his bag, he headed straight for the trail. As he walked, his mind raced, as it always did when he was alone with his thoughts. The uncertainty was still there, lurking, but it was different now. It wasn't a sense of panic. It was more like an invitation to explore, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what the future held, and to trust that the journey would unfold in its own time. The trail wound through the trees, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the dirt path and the distant call of birds overhead. It wasn't long before Mark found himself at a small clearing, the mountains rising majestically before him. He stopped, standing in awe of the view. It was breathtaking. The scale of it all, the vast expanse of land, the towering peaks, reminded him that his worries, his fears, were so small in comparison. It made the questions he had about his future seem less pressing, less important, even. He took a deep breath, the fresh mountain air filling his lungs. In that moment, he realized something. He didn't need all the answers. He didn't need to know exactly what his life would look like in the next year, or 5 years, or 10. What he needed was the space to grow, to learn, to trust that the answers would come when the time was right. He sat down on a large rock, closing his eyes and letting the silence wrap around him. The quiet was not empty. It was full of possibility. This was his time to listen, to be still. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He wasn't running toward some ideal version of success. He was simply being. And in that moment, being felt like enough. Mark woke up early the next morning, the light from the rising sun spilling gently into his small hotel room. The night had been quiet, too quiet, in fact, the kind of stillness that made him feel as though the world itself had paused, just for him. It was different from the constant hum of the city, where the noise of traffic, the chatter of people, and the vibrations of everyday life were always there, filling the air with a kind of urgency. Here, there was only the soft rustling of trees and the occasional distant sound of a bird. It was peaceful, and yet, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was a prelude to something he needed to face. He stretched and got up, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. It wasn't just about the mountains or the air. It wasn't just about escaping the city for a while. This weekend, as much as it was about quiet and reflection, was also about him confronting something he had been running from for a long time. Himself. The uncertainty of the last few weeks had been unsettling, to say the least. It wasn't the first time in his life that he had been unsure about his path, but this time felt different. This time, the questions didn't have simple answers. No longer could he tell himself that success was the only thing that mattered. No longer could he ignore the gnawing feeling that his life was missing something fundamental. Mark got dressed in hiking gear, his boots sturdy and ready for the trail that had been calling to him since the day before. The cool mountain air greeted him as he stepped outside, and he felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, as if the mountains themselves were inviting him to be present, to listen to the deeper questions that had been brewing inside him. He was alone, and for the first time, that didn't feel lonely. It felt necessary. The trail was much steeper this time, winding up the mountain with more of a challenge. But Mark didn't mind. With each step, it was as if the physical effort of climbing was helping to clear the fog in his mind. He focused on his breath, his footsteps, the movement of his body, feeling the weight of his decisions and his uncertainties lifted, just a little bit, with each ascent. As he reached a clearing, Mark stopped and leaned against a large boulder. His heart pounded, but it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from something deeper, something more profound. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. It was from when he was a child, a long-forgotten moment in time. He remembered sitting on the porch of his childhood home, his father beside him, looking out at the vast expanse of the field that stretched out before them. His father had said something then that Mark had never fully understood until now. The quiet can be your loudest teacher if you let it. At the time, it had sounded like a strange and abstract idea, something that couldn't possibly make sense in his young mind. But now, it was starting to click. The quiet wasn't just a backdrop to his life. It was the space where he could hear himself think, where he could process what was happening in his heart and mind. It was where the questions he had been running from could finally be heard, not as distractions, but as opportunities. Opportunities to learn, to grow, and to evolve. Mark took a deep breath, the scent of pine trees and fresh earth filling his lungs. There it was again, that sense of clarity, like the fog of his thoughts was beginning to clear, and the landscape of his life was coming into sharper focus. For so long, he had been running toward things that didn't matter, trying to fill the emptiness with achievements, with success. But what if, he thought, the answer wasn't in doing more? What if it was in doing less, in slowing down and being present? His mind wandered to his job, to the life he had built in the city. He had spent so much time defining himself by his career, by the things he had accomplished. But now, here, in the mountains, none of that mattered. It wasn't that his job or the work he did wasn't important, but that it had become an identity, one that had blurred out the person he truly was. The Mark who was passionate, the Mark who loved to laugh, the Mark who wanted more than just titles and accolades. He hadn't given himself permission to be all of those things, to simply be who he was at his core. He sat down on the boulder, the weight of the realization settling in his chest. He needed to change. He had to. But this change wouldn't be about quitting his job or making some grand, sweeping gesture. It would be about letting go of the beliefs that had held him back, about stepping into a new way of being, one where he could be both productive and present, driven but grounded. He needed to stop chasing the future and start living in the present. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Mark looked up to see a man approaching, older than him, with weathered skin and a gait that suggested he had spent many years hiking these trails. The man gave him a nod, a friendly smile on his face. "Beautiful morning," the man said, his voice deep and calm. "It really is," Mark replied, standing up from the boulder. "I'm new to this area, actually, just trying to clear my head." The man studied him for a moment before speaking again. "That's what nature does, clears the head. But sometimes, it also brings the hard stuff to the surface. It forces you to deal with things you've been avoiding." Mark didn't know why, but the stranger's words resonated with him deeply. It was as if he had been speaking to the very heart of Mark's own struggles. The man's eyes seemed to see through him, as if he knew exactly what Mark had been running from. Mark nodded. "Yeah, that's exactly it. I've been running for a long time, but now, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do next." The older man smiled gently. "There's no rush, son. The mountains don't ask you to move quickly. They just ask you to be present. And that's all you need to do. Be where you are. Trust that the path will reveal itself in time." Mark stood silently, the quiet weight of the stranger's words sinking in. He wasn't sure why, but something about the exchange felt significant. It was as though this man, this brief encounter, had given him a gift, a small piece of clarity that he didn't realize he needed. The man turned to leave, offering Mark one last glance. "The answers you're looking for are already inside you. Sometimes, you just have to slow down enough to hear them." Mark watched him disappear down the trail, feeling as if the world had paused for just a moment. He took a deep breath, his body and mind finally in sync. He was here, he was present, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the quiet. The day passed quietly, with Mark continuing his hike along the trails, his mind increasingly calm and at ease. The mountains, with their towering peaks and wide open spaces, had a way of putting things into perspective. He was learning something profound from the quiet, that sometimes silence wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of truth. The more time he spent in these mountains, the more he could hear his own thoughts, not as a jumbled mess of doubts, but as whispers of clarity he had been too busy to hear before. By late afternoon, Mark found himself sitting on a wooden bench at the edge of a small lake, its still surface reflecting the blue sky above and the jagged ridges surrounding it. He had hiked deeper into the woods, following a narrow path that led him to this secluded spot. The only sound was the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water and the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. He sat there, watching the water ripple gently with the breeze, contemplating everything that had led him here. There had been a time not too long ago when he had been caught up in the chaos of his life, the rush to get ahead, the constant need to prove himself. He had been so focused on external success that he had lost touch with the one thing that truly mattered, himself. Mark had spent years chasing an image of success, an image that didn't belong to him but to someone else's idea of what life should be. He had climbed the corporate ladder, accumulated accolades, but all of it had felt hollow, disconnected from his deeper desires. The change he felt now wasn't just about a shift in his career or lifestyle. It was about reclaiming the parts of him he had lost, those quiet, forgotten pieces that had been overshadowed by ambition and external expectations. The quiet of the mountains was doing something inside him. It was allowing him to remember who he was before the weight of the world's demands had shaped him into someone else. Mark took a deep breath, pulling the crisp mountain air into his lungs. For the first time, he felt a real connection to the moment. The mountain, the lake, the trees. It was all so simple, and yet so profoundly grounding. He closed his eyes and let the stillness of the place wash over him. A thought surfaced, a quiet realization that had been lingering at the edge of his mind all day. It was time to make some changes, yes? But the real change had to start within. His life wasn't going to look the same as it once had, not because of a dramatic transformation or an impulsive decision, but because of the way he was choosing to live, to be present, to connect with his own desires rather than constantly trying to meet other people's expectations. In the past, Mark would have spent this entire trip trying to work out a strategy, some kind of plan for the future. He would have taken notes, set goals, plotted his next steps. But today, he had done none of that. Instead, he had allowed himself to simply be. And the act of simply being had unlocked something within him. A new way of thinking, a deeper level of clarity. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to have all the answers. What he needed was patience with himself. Patience and trust in the process. As the evening light began to fade, casting long shadows over the water, Mark felt the pull of a decision. He knew that his time in the mountains had been important, but the real test would be how he returned to his life. Would he slip back into old habits? Would he fall into the familiar rhythm of work, deadlines, and endless striving? Or would he take what he had learned here, this sense of stillness, of connection, and carry it with him into his everyday life? The answer wasn't clear yet, but Mark knew one thing for sure. Whatever the next step was, it would be taken with intention. He wasn't going to rush anymore. The pressure to have everything figured out had been lifted. For once, it was okay to not know exactly what would come next. For once, he felt okay with the uncertainty. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was freedom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark stood up from the bench, stretching his legs and taking one last look at the lake. It was time to head back to the hotel, but this time, he didn't feel the urgency to hurry. Instead, he walked slowly, savoring each step, feeling the earth beneath his feet and the cool air filling his lungs. He wasn't just walking toward the hotel. He was walking toward the future, toward a new way of being. A future that didn't need to be defined by a rigid set of expectations, but by the simple act of living fully, intentionally, and with purpose. The path back to the hotel was quiet, but in a way, Mark felt like he had just begun a journey. Not one that would take him to a new place, but one that would take him deeper within himself. Later that night, after a simple dinner at the small cafe near his hotel, Mark returned to his room and sat at the desk, pulling out his journal. He hadn't written much over the past few days, but tonight, it felt right. There was something inside him that needed to be put into words. He began to write, not about goals or plans, but about the journey he had taken in the mountains, about the quiet and the stillness that had allowed him to hear his own voice again, about the clarity that had emerged from the silence. He wrote about how the mountains had given him something he couldn't have found anywhere else, the permission to pause, to reflect, to be. As the words flowed onto the page, Mark realized that this trip hadn't just been about clearing his head. It had been about clearing his heart. It was about letting go of the things that didn't serve him, the things he had been holding onto out of fear or obligation. And in that space, he had made room for something new, a deeper sense of purpose, a deeper connection to himself. Mark closed his journal and leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that the most important thing he could do was stay true to himself. Tomorrow, he would head back to the city. But when he returned, it wouldn't be the same. Because Mark was different now. Not because of any external changes, but because of the quiet transformation that had taken place inside him. And with that, Mark closed his eyes, ready for whatever the future would bring, knowing that he was finally on the path that was truly his. The morning came too soon, as it often does when you're on the verge of something significant. Mark packed his bag slowly, taking extra care to fold each item neatly, almost as though the simple act of preparing for his departure might prolong the peace he had found in the mountains. The quiet, the clarity, the space to think. It was all about to end. At least, that's what he thought. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The real journey had just begun. As he loaded his suitcase into the back of the small taxi that had come to pick him up from the hotel, Mark felt a tug in his chest. He didn't want to leave. The mountains had offered him something that was impossible to find in the hustle of city life. A sense of peace, a sense of being. The distance from his normal life had allowed him to rediscover a part of himself that had been buried under years of chasing ambition and external validation. But the mountains weren't meant to be a permanent escape. They had given him the space to clear his head, to reevaluate his priorities. But the real test would be what he did when he returned to the life he had left behind. Could he carry the lessons from this trip into the whirlwind of work, the noise of city life, the constant pull to do more, be more? The drive to the airport was uneventful, with the landscape slowly shifting from the vast, open fields and towering peaks of the mountains to the more familiar, flat stretches of the highway leading back to the city. It felt like the world was closing in again, the concrete jungle creeping back into his consciousness. But Mark was determined to hold on to what he had learned. As he boarded the flight home, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt equipped to face whatever came his way. No longer would he let his life be dictated by other people's expectations. No longer would he chase a version of success that didn't align with who he truly was. He wasn't going to be perfect, he knew that, but he was going to try. The flight back was smooth, but Mark couldn't help but notice how disconnected it felt. The rush of the airport, the noise of people hurrying to catch their flights, the constant movement. It was the same as when he had left, but this time, he saw it through a different lens. The city was alive, vibrant, fast-paced. But it wasn't the only way to live, and he didn't have to lose himself in it. When he arrived back at his apartment, it was almost surreal. The familiar sounds, the familiar spaces. It felt like coming home, but it also felt like stepping into a world he had been away from for too long. As he opened the door to his apartment, he paused. It was a small thing, but it was his, and in that moment, it felt like the start of a new chapter. The first few days back were a blur. He went through the motions, work, emails, meetings, everything that had seemed so urgent just a week ago. But something had shifted. He was no longer allowing the endless flow of tasks to define his day. Instead, he was carving out moments for himself, even if they were small. He started waking up a little earlier, just to sit with his thoughts before the world started demanding his attention. He found time for a morning walk, for a cup of coffee without looking at his phone. It was a small change, but it was a start. He reached out to Lily the day after he returned. He had missed their conversations and wanted to share how different he felt. "I'm back," he texted. "The trip was everything I needed and more. It gave me some real perspective. I think I'm ready to make some changes. Slowly, but definitely." Her response was quick, as always. "I'm so happy for you. I knew you'd come back changed. Tell me everything. What's your next step?" Mark smiled at the message. He wasn't sure yet what the next step would look like, but he knew it had to be intentional. It wasn't about doing more. It was about living differently, about being present, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. He spent the next few weeks making small adjustments to his routine. He started setting clearer boundaries with work. No longer would he let work consume his evenings. He began saying no to things that didn't align with his new values. For the first time, he was learning to prioritize his own well-being, to listen to his body and his heart instead of constantly chasing after external markers of success. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where old habits crept back in, moments when the city's noise threatened to drown out his newfound peace. But Mark didn't give up. He kept going, one step at a time. One evening, about a month after returning from his trip, Mark sat on his couch, a glass of wine in hand, staring out the window. It had been a good day, a quiet day. He had completed everything on his to-do list, but without the frantic energy that had once accompanied it. He felt accomplished, but in a different way than before. It wasn't about being busy. It was about feeling grounded, about knowing that his actions aligned with his deeper values. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Lily. "How's it going? I've been thinking about you. How's everything feeling after the changes you've been making?" Mark sat there for a moment, pondering the question. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. He wasn't where he wanted to be just yet, but he was moving in the right direction. He took a deep breath and typed out a response. It's hard, but it's good. I'm learning to slow down, to listen. The city doesn't feel as overwhelming anymore. It's like I'm finally seeing it for what it is, a place to live, not a race to win. I'm taking it one day at a time, but I'm excited to keep going. He hit send and smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction that was new to him. The road ahead was still unclear, and the future would hold its own challenges. But for the first time, Mark wasn't afraid of those challenges. He had learned to trust himself, to trust the process. The quiet had taught him that the answers didn't always come all at once, but that didn't mean they weren't already inside of him. Mark knew that life wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about being open to the journey, wherever it took him. And for the first time in a long time, he was truly ready to embrace whatever came next. It had been a few months since Mark's trip to the mountains, and things had started to settle into a rhythm. Life wasn't perfect, but it was different. He felt more grounded, more aware of the choices he was making, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The frantic hustle to prove himself had slowed, replaced by a quiet sense of fulfillment that came from living with intention. But as with all things in life, the calm was often tested. One Thursday morning, Mark arrived at his office to an email from his boss, Caroline. The subject line read, "Urgent, meeting with the board." His stomach dropped. He hadn't expected this. Caroline had been pushing for some new projects, new initiatives, things that had been bubbling under the surface for months. And now, it seemed like the time had come to make those ideas a reality. Mark knew what was at stake. The board would be evaluating his performance, possibly deciding his future within the company. The pressure was real, and for a brief moment, all the calm he had cultivated in the mountains seemed far away. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old voice in his head whispering, "You need to prove yourself. This is your chance." His mind raced. What if the board didn't see his vision? What if they thought he wasn't ready? His career, his future. It all felt like it was on the line. Mark couldn't help but fall back into the patterns he had worked so hard to leave behind. The rush, the panic, the need to be seen as competent, capable, successful. He sat down at his desk and stared at the screen. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of where to start. He had spent months trying to slow down, to listen to his own desires, but now he was being pulled back into the whirlwind. The weight of expectations, both his own and others, felt suffocating. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Lily. "Hey, I was thinking about you today. How's everything going with work? You're probably killing it, huh?" Mark hesitated before replying. He wanted to tell her about the pressure, about the fear creeping back in, but he didn't want to admit how much he was struggling. Instead, he typed, "Yeah, things are good. Just a little busy. Big meeting coming up with the board. Should be fine, though." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He knew he had come a long way since his trip. He had learned to listen to his inner voice, to trust himself, but there was still this lingering feeling that he wasn't enough. That maybe, despite everything he had learned, he still wasn't living up to the expectations that others had of him, and worse, the ones he had of himself. Mark stood up, pacing his office. He was stuck. He didn't want to fall back into old habits, but how could he ignore the pressure? How could he not give it everything he had? The stakes were high, and the fear of failure was gnawing at him. His phone buzzed again, breaking him from his thoughts. It was Caroline. "Mark, just wanted to remind you that the meeting with the board is tomorrow. Please have all your materials prepared. They'll want to see the numbers and the projections. Let me know if you need anything." A knot tightened in his stomach. Numbers, projections, that's what it always came down to. The tangible, measurable things that he could show the board. But as he read the email again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnect. Was that all his work amounted to? Was he just another cog in the corporate machine? Someone who existed to produce numbers, to deliver results, to meet expectations? It was a question that had been haunting him since the day he stepped back into the office. Was this really the life he wanted? The past few months had been about slowing down, finding clarity, and reconnecting with his true self. But now, It seemed as though everything was being pulled into the current of external validation once more. The need to prove himself was stronger than ever. Mark glanced out the window, watching the city bustle below. People rushing to meetings, to appointments, to tasks. Everyone seemed so focused on their goals, so consumed by their work. And yet, Mark couldn't help but wonder if they were all feeling the same pressure, the same gnawing sense that they were only as valuable as their latest accomplishment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to ground himself. The mountain air, the stillness of the lake, the quiet moments of clarity, they felt like a distant memory now, lost in the noise of the city. But Mark knew deep down that the lessons he had learned hadn't gone away. He could still find his center, even in the chaos. And then, a thought occurred to him. He didn't have to choose between success and peace. He didn't have to prove his worth through external validation alone. He could bring the lessons of the mountains into this new chapter. The clarity, the quiet, the balance. He could face the pressure without letting it define him. Mark sat down at his desk and began to write. He didn't focus on the board meeting or the numbers just yet. He focused on himself, on what he needed to feel aligned with his true purpose. What do I want this meeting to be about? He thought. Is it just about numbers and projections, or is it about something more? As he wrote, the answer became clearer. The meeting wasn't just about impressing the board. It wasn't about delivering perfect numbers or ticking off all the boxes. It was about sharing his vision, about showing up authentically, even if that meant challenging the status quo, even if it meant not having all the answers. Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He had been trying to control the outcome, to mold himself into the version of success that the world expected. But now, he realized, success wasn't about conforming to someone else's idea of who he should be. It was about showing up as himself, as the person who had learned the importance of slowing down, of finding balance, of living with intention. The pressure didn't go away. It was still there, pressing down on him. But Mark had found a new way to carry it. He wasn't going to let the expectations define him anymore. He was going to define his own success, on his own terms. As he closed his laptop and stood up to prepare for the meeting, Mark felt a quiet confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of the unknown, because he knew, deep down, that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He just had to show up, fully, authentically, and with an open heart. The day of the board meeting had arrived, and Mark was up early. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could go right and what could go wrong. The weight of the meeting hung over him like a cloud, but today, something inside him felt different. It wasn't the old feeling of panic and anxiety, the relentless drive to impress and perform. It was a quiet kind of determination, a calm resolve that came from the realization that he had already done his best, and that no matter what happened today, he was enough. He dressed in his best suit, dark navy, crisp white shirt, and a tie that was just the right mix of professional without being too flashy. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he noticed a change. He didn't look the same as he had a few months ago, when he was caught in the relentless pressure of trying to keep up with the corporate world. He looked older, but not just because of the suit or the stress lines that had deepened over time. He looked more grounded, more present. The weight of expectations was still there, of course, but Mark wasn't about to let it control him today. He had come a long way since that trip to the mountains, and whatever happened in the meeting, he was going to be true to himself. Arriving at the office, Mark felt a familiar knot in his stomach. The building towered over him, a reminder of all the years he had spent climbing, striving, and sacrificing to get to this point. But today, he wasn't here to just prove his worth. He was here to share his vision, to speak honestly about where he believed the company could go, and to stand by his decisions, regardless of whether they were met with approval or not. The meeting room was large, with a polished wooden table at the center. The board members were already seated when Mark walked in, their expressions unreadable. Caroline was at the head of the table, her gaze sharp as she greeted him. "Good morning, Mark. We've been looking forward to hearing your proposal," she said with a tight smile. "Good morning," Mark replied, offering a nod as he walked to the front of the room. He set his papers down on the table, but his hands felt steady, his breath controlled. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The usual fear of judgment, the urge to perform, was gone. He took a deep breath, looked around at the faces staring back at him, and began. "Thank you for your time today," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I want to start by saying that this proposal isn't just about the numbers. It's about the direction we're headed, the future of this company, and how we can align our efforts to make a real impact, not just in terms of profits, but in the way we operate, in the way we treat our employees, and in the way we contribute to our community." The room was silent, and for a brief moment, Mark wondered if he had lost them. But he pressed on, feeling a sense of calm that was growing stronger with every word he spoke. "I know that the numbers are important. They always are. But I also believe that our success isn't solely defined by our financial reports. It's about our people, our culture, and how we build something that lasts. So, what I'm proposing today is a shift in how we approach our work, how we measure success, and how we invest in the future." He could see a few skeptical faces around the table. They were used to the same old metrics, the same old ways of thinking. But Mark didn't flinch. He spoke about the company's values, about how they could build a workplace culture that encouraged innovation, well-being, and sustainability, not just profit. He shared his thoughts on long-term goals, community outreach, and creating a workplace where employees felt valued, where creativity was nurtured, and where success was measured not only by financial gain but by how they impacted the world around them. The more Mark spoke, the more he felt the weight of the past few months lift from his shoulders. He wasn't trying to convince anyone to like him or to agree with his vision. He was simply sharing what he believed was the right path forward. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that the way they had been doing things wasn't working anymore. The world was changing, and they needed to change with it. As he wrapped up his presentation, Mark felt a sense of relief. It was done. He had said everything he needed to say. He stood there, waiting for the response, his heart beating a little faster as the room fell into silence. Caroline spoke first, her tone measured. "Mark, I appreciate your passion and your vision, but we need to see concrete results. These ideas are interesting, but how do we know they'll work? How do we know they won't just cost us more in the long run?" Mark nodded, expecting the question. He had anticipated skepticism, especially given how different his approach was from the traditional, numbers-driven mindset that the board was used to. But he wasn't backing down. "I believe that investing in our people, in our culture, and in long-term sustainability will pay off. It won't be immediate, but it will create a more resilient company, one that's adaptable, innovative, and engaged. That's the future I see. It's not just about the next quarter's profits. It's about building something that lasts." Another board member, Alan, leaned forward. "You're asking us to take a risk, Mark, to go against the grain of what's been working for us for years. That's not a small ask." "I'm not asking you to take an unreasonable risk," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking you to think about the future. If we don't adapt, if we don't change, we'll become irrelevant. The companies that thrive are the ones that evolve. We have to be willing to invest in that evolution, even if it's uncomfortable." For a long moment, the room was silent. Mark couldn't read their expressions, but he felt something shift. It wasn't immediate approval, but it wasn't rejection either. Caroline exchanged a glance with Alan, then with the others. Mark held his ground, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation. Finally, Caroline spoke again. "All right, Mark, we'll take this under consideration. We'll need more details on how we can implement your vision, but I see where you're going with this. It's not the traditional approach, but I'm willing to give it a shot." Mark nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The meeting wasn't over yet, but it had gone better than he had hoped. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just playing the game to get ahead. He was playing the game to make a difference, and that was enough for him. As he left the meeting room, Mark walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but that he had made the right choice by staying true to himself. Mark had no idea what would happen next, but the days following the board meeting were filled with a strange, electric energy. The usual post-meeting exhaustion was replaced with something else, a sense of possibility. It wasn't that everything had changed overnight, but something had shifted. The board had expressed interest, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. They hadn't just dismissed his ideas outright. They had acknowledged them, considered them, and promised to explore them further. That was a win in itself. The following morning, Mark sat at his desk, staring at the list of follow-up tasks the board had asked for. They wanted a more detailed plan on how to integrate the new approach into the company's existing framework. They had questions about cost, timeline, and feasibility, and they wanted numbers, because numbers were the language they understood best. He could already feel the familiar tension in his shoulders, the sense of overwhelm creeping back in. But today, things felt different. Mark had spent months trying to craft a vision that was more than just about growth at any cost. Now, he was going to bring that vision to life in a way that felt authentic to him. He couldn't lose sight of that. The pressure to perform was still there, but it no longer had the power to define him. He was in control of his own narrative now. Just then, a message popped up on his screen. It was from Lily. "How did the meeting go? I've been thinking about you all day." Mark smiled, feeling the familiar warmth spread through him. Lily had been one of the few people who had seen him through all the ups and downs of the past year. She had been there when he was burned out, when he was questioning his choices, and when he had found a new sense of purpose. She had believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. "It went well," he typed back. "I think they're starting to see what I see. It's not going to be easy, but they're open to the changes I suggested." He paused, rereading the message. He wanted to tell her how nervous he had been, how much the pressure had weighed on him before the meeting, but he didn't want to burden her with that. Instead, he focused on the positive. "It feels good to finally speak up, to share what I believe in, you know? Even if they don't completely agree with me yet, I know I made the right choice by being honest." Lily's response came almost immediately. "I'm so proud of you. Seriously, Mark. You've come so far. It's amazing to see you standing up for what matters. I know it's scary, but you're doing it. Keep pushing, no matter what. I'm here for you, always." The words hit him harder than he expected. She didn't just say she was proud of him. She said she was there for him, always. The weight of that simple message washed over him. It reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey, that there were people who believed in him and cared about his well-being. Beyond the numbers, beyond the success, beyond the corporate grind. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, follow-up calls, and preparing new materials for the board's next meeting. Mark worked efficiently, but there was a part of him that remained focused inward. He was learning to listen to his own voice, and it felt like a revelation. That evening, after dinner, Mark decided to take a walk. The city streets were quieter than usual, and the cool air felt refreshing. He had always been someone who thrived on activity, on constant movement, but lately, he had been finding solace in stillness, in the moments when he allowed himself to simply be. As he walked, his phone buzzed. It was a reminder, a meeting with his boss, Caroline, the following morning to discuss the next steps in his proposal. For a split second, a wave of unease washed over him. The familiar feeling of dread returned. What if they changed their minds? What if they decided the whole thing was too risky, too unconventional? But then, he stopped walking, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of something important. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions anymore. No matter the outcome, he had already done something significant by staying true to his vision. The rest, he could handle. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his mom. "I've been thinking about you. How's everything going with work? I know it's a big step, but I believe in you." The simplicity of her message caught him off guard. There were no demands, no expectations, just love and belief in him, no matter what. It was exactly what he needed to hear. "Thanks, Mom. It's going well. I'm working through some things, but I'm feeling good about it. I'll keep you updated." He sent the message and continued walking, feeling lighter than he had all day. He realized that part of the pressure he had been carrying wasn't just from the board or from his boss. It was the pressure he had placed on himself, to prove that he was enough, to prove that he could do it all, to meet every expectation. But what if the pressure wasn't the point? What if, instead of trying to meet everyone else's expectations, he focused on creating his own? What if his vision for the company, his personal growth, his relationships, what if all of that was enough, without needing to constantly prove it? The more Mark thought about it, the more the weight lifted. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to please everyone. He just needed to stay true to himself, to the values that mattered most to him. Everything else would follow. When he returned home that evening, he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to prepare for his meeting with Caroline. As he outlined his thoughts for the upcoming discussion, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that whatever happened, he was on the right path. He wasn't just chasing success anymore. He was chasing fulfillment, and that made all the difference. The following morning, Mark arrived at the office early, his mind a whirl of thoughts and plans. The sun was just rising, casting a soft golden hue through the large windows of the building, and as he stepped into his office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today's meeting with Caroline could be the turning point, he knew. The decisions made here could shape the future of his proposal and potentially his future within the company. But despite the nerves that still lingered in his stomach, Mark had a quiet confidence he hadn't felt before. He had made it this far by staying true to himself, and he wasn't going to back down now. He opened his laptop, reviewing the materials he had put together. The projections, the figures, the strategies, everything was in place. But this time, he wasn't just focusing on numbers. He wasn't going to simply present a polished, safe proposal. He was going to show Caroline the bigger picture, the culture shift, the long-term growth, the values that would drive the company forward. The door to his office opened, and Caroline walked in, a folder in her hand. Her expression was businesslike, but there was something different in her eyes today. Something curious, maybe even a little open. "Morning, Mark," she said, giving him a nod as she took a seat across from his desk. "Good morning," Mark replied, standing up to greet her. "Thanks for taking the time to meet today." Caroline smiled slightly. "Of course. I've been thinking about your proposal, and I want to dive deeper into it. I know you've put a lot of effort into this, and I'm intrigued. But we still need to figure out how this fits into the bigger picture." Mark nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. He was used to Caroline's skepticism. It was part of her job to challenge new ideas, but today, he sensed something different. She wasn't just going through the motions. She was engaged, willing to listen. "Right. That's exactly what I want to talk about," Mark said, leaning forward slightly. "This isn't just a set of changes. It's a new direction. A direction that aligns with where I think the company needs to go in order to remain relevant and to lead, not just follow." Caroline raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. She simply waited for him to continue. "I know the numbers are important," Mark said, "but we've been too focused on short-term gains, on maximizing efficiency without considering the long-term consequences. If we keep pushing for profits above all else, we risk losing our identity, our culture. We risk burning out our people. And that's not sustainable." Caroline sat back, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the folder. "I understand the sentiment, but we're in a competitive industry. We can't afford to risk growth for the sake of culture. We need to balance both." "I agree," Mark said, his voice firm but measured. "That's why I'm proposing an approach where culture and growth aren't at odds, where we create a work environment that encourages innovation and well-being, and where we measure success by more than just financial metrics. I'm talking about long-term sustainability, not just for the company, but for our people too." There was a long pause, and Mark could feel the weight of the conversation settling between them. Caroline was thinking it over, weighing his words. For a moment, Mark's confidence wavered, and doubt crept in. What if she didn't agree? What if she decided it was all too risky? But then, Caroline leaned forward slightly, and Mark's breath caught in his chest. "I have to admit, Mark, this is different. I didn't expect this approach, and I'm still not sure if it's exactly what the company needs, but you've made me think. I'll give you that." Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was the first time Caroline had acknowledged the potential in his vision. That was a step forward. "I think," Caroline continued, "that you're onto something here. We've been so fixated on the bottom line that we've overlooked the bigger picture. But how do we convince the board? They're going to want to see results, and fast. How do we prove that this isn't just a pipe dream?" Mark smiled, the tension in his shoulders finally starting to loosen. This was the conversation he had been waiting for. "That's where the next step comes in," he said. "I've put together a detailed timeline, one that addresses both short-term goals and long-term sustainability. We'll start small, test the waters, and then scale it. I'm not asking for a full overhaul right away. But if we can make incremental changes, show that they work, and measure the results, I'm confident the board will come around. Caroline nodded slowly, processing everything Mark had said. She opened the folder in front of her and glanced at the proposal he had submitted. She flipped through a few pages, her eyes scanning the data. Mark watched her carefully, waiting for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Okay, Mark. I think you've convinced me. Let's take this to the board, but you need to be ready. They're going to challenge you. They're going to want to see hard numbers. If we're going to move forward with this, it's going to need a solid plan." Mark felt a rush of relief, tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. But it was a significant step forward, a moment he had been working toward for months. He had earned Caroline's trust, and now it was time to face the board again, armed with the same clarity and confidence that had guided him so far. "I'll be ready," Mark said, his voice steady. "I'll have everything prepared, but I believe in this. I believe in what we can build together. And I think the board will too." Caroline stood up and extended her hand. "All right, let's do this." As Mark shook her hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his voice, his vision, and the courage to follow through. And no matter what the board decided, he knew that this journey was only just beginning. The days following his meeting with Caroline were a whirlwind. Mark barely had time to reflect on the breakthrough they had made before he was thrust into preparation for the upcoming board meeting. Caroline had agreed to take his proposal to the table, and now it was time to face the ultimate test, the full boardroom. The morning of the meeting, Mark sat at his desk, reviewing his notes one last time. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he tried to gather his thoughts. This was the moment that could change everything for him, for the company. He knew the stakes were high. If the board approved his vision, it could set the company on a path toward a new era of growth and innovation. But if they rejected it, it would be back to the drawing board. The thought of rejection still gnawed at him, but today, he felt different. There was no panic in his chest, no paralyzing fear of failure. He had come this far by believing in what he was doing, and no matter what happened, he knew he had done his best. He had stayed true to his principles, to the vision that felt right, even when it wasn't the easy route. And that was enough. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Lily. "You've got this, Mark. I know it's a big day, but remember what we talked about. Stay grounded and true to yourself. I'm rooting for you." Mark smiled and quickly typed a response. "Thanks, Lily. It means a lot to have your support. I'm ready." With that, he grabbed his bag and headed for the boardroom. As Mark entered the large conference room, the weight of the moment hit him. The long wooden table stretched out in front of him, surrounded by the faces of the people who could make or break his proposal. Caroline was already there, seated at the head of the table, her usual composed demeanor in place. The other board members, including Alan, Sarah, and Tom, were scattered around the room, their eyes fixed on him as he took his seat at the front. "Good morning, Mark," Caroline greeted him, her voice cool but not unkind. "Morning," Mark replied, offering a nod as he settled into his seat. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Everyone was waiting for him to speak, to make his case. This was it, the moment he had been building toward. Caroline opened the meeting. "Thank you all for joining today. We're here to discuss the proposal Mark has put forward regarding a new direction for the company. Mark, why don't you take it from here?" Mark took a deep breath and stood, walking to the front of the room where a projector screen displayed his proposal. As he glanced around the room, he noticed the skepticism in some of their faces, the furrowed brows, the crossed arms. But there was something else too, a quiet curiosity. They wanted to hear him out. "Thank you, Caroline," Mark began, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling in his stomach. "I appreciate the opportunity to present my ideas to you all today. As I've shared before, I believe this company has reached a crossroads. We've done incredibly well, and our success is undeniable. But to continue growing in a sustainable, meaningful way, we need to rethink how we define success." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not suggesting we abandon the pursuit of profit, far from it. What I'm proposing is a shift in how we balance short-term gains with long-term goals. Our people, our culture, our community, these elements are just as important as our quarterly numbers. If we invest in them, I believe we'll see a return that goes beyond what we can measure on a balance sheet. Alan, the most vocal critic of his proposal, leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of his face. Mark, I understand where you're coming from, but you're asking us to change the foundation of the company's operations. You want us to focus on culture and community over profits. How do we justify that to our investors? How do we make the case that this is a smart financial move? Mark met Alan's gaze. I'm not asking us to abandon profits. What I'm asking is that we recognize that the traditional way of measuring success, purely by financials, isn't enough anymore. The world is changing. Consumers are more informed, more invested in the values of the companies they support. Employees are looking for workplaces that care about more than just the bottom line. If we create a culture that aligns with those values, we'll attract top talent, build stronger relationships with our customers, and create a brand that stands for something meaningful. There was a moment of silence as Alan processed Mark's words. The other board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others still skeptical. Mark could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he pressed on. I've outlined a plan to implement these changes gradually, so it's not a shock to the system, he continued. We'll start with small steps, investing in employee well-being programs, launching community outreach initiatives, and fostering a culture of innovation and collaboration. And we'll measure success not just by revenue, but by employee satisfaction, customer loyalty, and the impact we're making in our communities. Caroline spoke up, her voice measured. I have to admit, Mark, I'm intrigued by your vision, but we need to know how we'll keep this sustainable. How do we scale this? How do we prove that it's not just a feel-good initiative, but a strategy that will lead to real, tangible results? Mark nodded, expecting the question. I've developed a roadmap for scaling these initiatives over the next 3 years. It's about creating a balance between short-term investments and long-term outcomes. The key is to integrate these changes into the core of what we do, not as a side project, but as part of our company's DNA. Tom, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke. I can see the potential in this approach, but we've seen other companies try something similar, and it didn't always work out. What makes you so confident this will succeed? Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of truth. I believe in the vision, but more importantly, I believe in the people behind it. We have the right team to make this happen, and I've seen firsthand how a positive, inclusive culture can lead to better results. We're not just hoping for change, we're building it, step by step, and I'm committed to leading that change. The room fell silent again. The weight of the decision hung in the air like a thick fog, and Mark could feel the tension building as the board members deliberated. But then, Caroline broke the silence. All right, Mark, you've made a compelling case, she said, her tone shifting slightly. We'll need more details, of course, but I think there's potential here. Let's move forward with further planning, and we'll review this again at the next board meeting. Mark exhaled, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't a full approval yet, but it was a step in the right direction. He had pushed them to think differently, to consider a future that didn't just focus on numbers, but on people and purpose. And that was enough to keep the momentum going. As the meeting wrapped up and the board members filed out of the room, Mark couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but for the first time, he felt confident that he was on the right path. The days after the board meeting were filled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Mark had expected more of a victory lap, but instead, the reality of the situation set in. He hadn't received full approval yet. Caroline's agreement to move forward with further planning was a positive step, but the road to final approval was still long and uncertain. He spent hours refining the details, preparing for the next phase of the proposal. The board wanted specifics, numbers, timelines, measurable outcomes. They weren't going to let him simply sell the idea. They wanted proof. And Mark knew that, in order to get that proof, he would need to bring his vision to life in a way that would exceed even their skepticism. The pressure was mounting, but he had faced challenges before. This wasn't the first time he had been asked to perform under a microscope. And this certainly wouldn't be the last. But something about this challenge felt different. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It wasn't just about the board. It was about something bigger, a vision of leadership, of creating a work environment that people could be proud of, where personal values and professional success could coexist in harmony. Mark had already started putting together more concrete steps to demonstrate how the new culture and values could be embedded into the company. Employee surveys, pilot programs, metrics to track engagement. All of it was coming together. But there was one crucial element he hadn't fully considered. How would his proposal impact the people closest to him? One evening, after a long day of revising his plan, Mark found himself at a small cafe near his apartment, nursing a cup of coffee. He hadn't seen Lily in a few days, and as he sat there, watching the steam rise from the cup, he realized just how much he missed their conversations. She had been his confidant throughout this entire process, the one person he could rely on to tell him the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Lily. "Hey, how's it going? I know things must be crazy for you right now, but I'd love to see you soon." Mark smiled and quickly replied, "It's a bit overwhelming, but I'm managing. Let's meet up tomorrow? I'll fill you in on everything. I could use a little distraction." The response came almost instantly. "Sounds perfect. I'll see you tomorrow. Can't wait to hear all about it." As Mark read her message, a wave of gratitude washed over him. Lily had been there through the highs and lows of his journey, but lately, he had started to notice a shift in their dynamic. She had always been supportive, but something had changed. The more he had poured himself into the proposal, the more he had neglected other aspects of his life. His friendships, his own well-being, and most notably, his relationship with Lily. He hadn't realized it at the time, but as his focus had sharpened on getting the proposal right, he had distanced himself from the people who mattered most. He hadn't meant to, but it had happened. And now, with the weight of the proposal looming over him, he was starting to question how much of his personal life he had sacrificed to this cause. The next afternoon, Mark met Lily at a small park near her apartment. It was one of those rare, quiet moments in the city, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves and the sound of children laughing in the distance. They found a bench, and after a brief hug, Mark sat down beside her. "How are you really doing?" Lily asked, her eyes searching his face. "I know you're stressed, but I want to know if you're okay, Mark. I haven't heard from you much lately." Mark hesitated for a moment. It was hard to admit, but she deserved the truth. I'm trying to be, but it's been overwhelming. The board's still not fully sold on my proposal, and the pressure's building. I've been so focused on making this work that I think I've lost sight of everything else. I haven't really been present, and it's affecting the people around me. It's affecting us." Lily reached over, placing her hand gently on his. "I know you're passionate about this, Mark, and I admire you for that. But you can't let this project define you. It's important, but it's not everything." Mark sighed. "I know. I don't know how to balance it all. Every time I feel like I'm making progress, it feels like there's something else I have to prove. It's exhausting." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I get it, but the truth is, you can't keep pouring from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself, too. Not just the company, not just the proposal. I'm here for you, but I can't help you if you don't let me." His heart tightened at her words. She was right. He had been so caught up in the whirlwind of work that he had forgotten to check in with himself, to ask if he was okay, if he was taking care of his own needs. "I've been so focused on proving myself, proving that I can make this work, that I've been neglecting everything else," Mark admitted. "I don't want to lose sight of what really matters." Lily squeezed his hand. "You won't. Just remember that it's okay to step back sometimes. You don't have to carry everything on your shoulders alone." Mark looked at her, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. "I don't want to lose this, what we have. You mean a lot to me, Lily, and I don't want to let this project take over everything." Lily smiled softly, her eyes warm. "You won't. I know you, Mark, and I know you'll find a way to make it all work. But you have to be kind to yourself along the way." They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's company. For the first time in days, Mark felt a sense of peace. The weight on his shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. He wasn't alone in this. He had people who cared about him, people who were rooting for him, not just for his professional success, but for his happiness and well-being. As they stood up to leave, Mark felt a renewed sense of clarity. He still had a long way to go with the proposal, but he wasn't in this alone. He had the support of people who truly mattered, people like Lily, who reminded him that he didn't need to sacrifice everything for success. The days following his heart-to-heart with Lily were transformative for Mark. He had learned to let go of the crushing pressure he had placed on himself, taking small steps each day to regain his equilibrium. He had refocused on the bigger picture, acknowledging that the proposal was only one part of his life, not the sum total of who he was. The world hadn't stopped turning, and neither had his relationships or his self-worth. Mark threw himself into refining his plan with renewed energy and a clearer perspective. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to others in the same way. He now understood that success was a holistic endeavor. It was about growth, personal, professional, and communal. And in order for the company to thrive, he needed to lead by example, not by martyrdom. Caroline had been pleased with the progress he'd made, and her support had grown. The board was still cautious, but they were intrigued by the direction Mark was pushing them toward. He had earned their trust, but it wasn't enough. He needed to show them results, to bring tangible proof that his vision wasn't just a lofty dream. It had to be practical, sustainable, and profitable. No one would be convinced unless the plan was fully realized. That's where Mark's focus shifted, to the execution. He began meeting with his team, gathering feedback from employees at all levels. He wanted their input, their ideas, and their concerns. This wasn't just a proposal for the boardroom. It was a cultural shift that would affect everyone in the company. Everyone had to be on board. It was a Friday morning when Mark received the call that would change everything. "Mark, it's Caroline. We're ready. The board wants to meet again. We're going to vote on your proposal." The words sent a ripple of excitement through his chest, but also a deep sense of nervous anticipation. He had worked so hard for this moment, but the reality of what was about to happen still felt surreal. "When's the meeting?" he asked, his voice steady but the adrenaline starting to surge through him. "This Monday, first thing. You'll need to have everything prepared. This is it." The line went quiet for a moment before Caroline added, "You've done incredible work, Mark. I'm confident in this, but just make sure everything is ready for a final push." Mark didn't reply immediately. He was still processing what she said. "This Monday. Everything on the line. Thanks, Caroline. I'll be ready." The weekend was a blur. Mark was on autopilot, finalizing presentations, double-checking his research, and rehearsing his pitch in front of the mirror. He knew the stakes were high. The board's decision would determine the company's future and his. But more than that, it would define who he was as a leader. Was he someone who could face challenges with grace? Someone who could bring people together and guide them through uncertainty? He worked tirelessly, but there were moments when he caught himself pausing, when the weight of the situation threatened to drag him under. At those times, he thought back to his conversation with Lily, the reminder that he wasn't defined by this proposal, and that he didn't need to shoulder the world alone. On Sunday evening, as Mark sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the final drafts of his presentation, his phone buzzed. It was Lily. "I know you've got a big day tomorrow, but just wanted to say you've got this. No matter what happens, you're doing the right thing. And I'm proud of you." Mark smiled as he read the message. It was simple, but exactly what he needed to hear. He quickly typed a reply. "Thanks, Lily. You're right. I'm ready. No matter what happens, I'm going to give it my all." The reassurance he found in her words gave him the strength he needed to sleep that night. As he closed his laptop and turned off the light, he knew tomorrow would be one of the most important days of his life. But he was no longer afraid. He was ready. Monday morning arrived with an undeniable intensity. Mark stood before the mirror, straightening his tie one final time. He had prepared for this moment, but there was still a sense of uncertainty gnawing at him. The board could still reject the proposal. They could still turn their backs on his vision. But that was something he had to face, no matter what. He arrived at the conference room early, setting up the projector and reviewing his notes one last time. Caroline was already there, waiting. She gave him an encouraging nod as he entered. "Ready?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with a quiet sense of determination. "I am," Mark replied. "Let's do this." The room was filled with a palpable energy as the board members took their seats. Alan, Sarah, and Tom were all present, as well as a few additional members who had been brought in for this crucial decision. Caroline stood at the head of the table, her posture exuding confidence. Mark took his seat at the front, his mind focused but calm. He had done everything he could to prepare, and now it was time to present his case. He started by recapping the company's current state, acknowledging the progress they had made. But then, he spoke of the future he believed was possible if they embraced the changes he had proposed. He spoke of a company that didn't just succeed in terms of profits, but succeeded in creating a lasting impact. A company that prioritized its people and its community as much as its shareholders. As he spoke, he could feel the room's energy shift. The skepticism was still there, but it was tempered by curiosity. They were listening. Mark could see it in their eyes. They wanted to believe. After his presentation, there was a long silence. Alan cleared his throat and spoke first. "I have to admit, Mark, I wasn't sure about this at first, but I've seen the groundwork you've laid. You've put in the work, and I believe you have a solid plan here. It's risky, but sometimes the risks are what drive us forward." Sarah chimed in next. "I agree. The strategy is bold, but the potential is undeniable. I'm willing to give this a chance. We'll have to monitor it closely, but I'm in." Tom, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally nodded. "It's a big leap, but I think it's worth the shot. I'm on board." Mark's heart raced, but he kept his composure. This was happening. They were backing him. He could hardly believe it. Caroline smiled at him, her voice firm and reassuring. "Congratulations, Mark. The proposal has been approved. Let's get to work." The room erupted into applause, and Mark stood up, his emotions overwhelming him. He had done it. The proposal wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was real, it was happening, and it was the beginning of something new for the company. Later that day, after the board meeting had concluded and the celebratory emails had been sent, Mark found himself alone in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the hurdles he had overcome. But most of all, he thought about the people who had supported him along the way. Caroline, his team, Lily. They were the ones who had given him the strength to push forward when everything seemed impossible. He took a deep breath and smiled. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt truly hopeful. He wasn't just starting a new chapter for the company. He was starting a new chapter for himself, one where success was about more than just numbers. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would stand the test of time. And he knew that with the right team, the right vision, and the right heart, anything was possible. Weeks passed since the board's approval, and the whirlwind of activity that followed felt like a blur. Mark's life had been consumed by the execution of his vision. The proposal had turned from a set of ideas into tangible actions, and every day brought new challenges. But this time, he felt more prepared, more grounded. He was no longer carrying the weight of the company on his shoulders alone. He had his team, his supporters, and, most importantly, his own belief in what they were building together. The changes he had outlined in his plan were slowly taking shape. The culture initiatives had been rolled out, with employee workshops and engagement activities designed to foster communication, creativity, and collaboration. There were still hurdles to overcome. Old habits were hard to break, but the results were starting to show. People were talking. The environment was shifting. Mark was especially proud of the impact on the leadership team. They were no longer just managers. They were mentors. They were learning how to listen, how to nurture the talents around them. Mark saw his vision of leadership coming to life, and it filled him with an indescribable sense of fulfillment. But the real proof of success was the way the employees were responding. The company's atmosphere was changing. It was no longer just a place where people worked. It was a place where they could thrive. There was a renewed sense of purpose that was palpable, and it was spreading through every level of the organization. One late afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting with his leadership team, Mark sat alone in his office. He gazed out the window, the city skyline stretching out before him, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought back to the very beginning, the moment he first walked into that boardroom, full of self-doubt, wondering if he was cut out for this kind of responsibility. He remembered the sharp sting of rejection he had felt before, the weight of failure looming over him, and the tension of every sleepless night as he worked to perfect his proposal. He remembered how the idea of not being enough had consumed him, but he had kept going, not because it was easy, but because he believed in what he was trying to create. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mark turned, expecting his assistant, but it was Caroline. "Mind if I come in?" she asked with a smile, her voice warm but professional. "Of course," Mark replied, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Caroline sat down, her expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to check in with you. How's everything going? I've been hearing some good things, but you've been quiet lately." Mark smiled, feeling the exhaustion that had been creeping up on him for weeks. "It's going well, Caroline. The culture initiatives are taking hold. People are engaged, and we're starting to see some positive changes. But there's a long way to go." Caroline nodded, her eyes filled with approval. "You've done something incredible here, Mark. I want you to know that. You didn't just push through an idea. You've changed the way we think about leadership and success. That's not easy." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. It was hard to articulate how much her words meant to him. "I couldn't have done it without you, and without the support of the team. I've learned so much during this process. I've learned about leadership, about myself, and about the kind of company I want to be a part of." Caroline leaned back, her gaze sharp but kind. "You've proven yourself more than you know. You didn't just deliver a proposal. You delivered a vision. And that's what leadership is all about. It's not just about making decisions. It's about inspiring people to follow you towards something greater." Mark absorbed her words. It felt surreal to hear such praise after everything he had gone through. But it was also the validation he hadn't known he needed. He had pushed through the self-doubt, the difficult decisions, and the endless hours of hard work. And now, he was beginning to see the fruits of that labor. "We're not there yet, though," he said quietly. "There's still so much work to do. It's not just about implementing changes. It's about maintaining them, evolving them, and making sure they're truly a part of our culture. This has to be sustainable." Caroline smiled. "I agree, but you're on the right track. And remember, sustainability isn't just about the company's bottom line. It's about the people. It's about making sure that we're creating an environment where they feel valued, respected, and inspired. You've already laid the foundation for that. Now, it's time to build on it." Mark nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had come so far, but there was still so much to accomplish. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was worth it. He wasn't just working to build a successful company anymore. He was working to create a legacy, a place where people could truly thrive. A few days later, Mark found himself at the annual company retreat. It was a momentous occasion, the first since the proposal had been approved and the cultural shift had begun. Employees from every department were gathered, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. It was clear that the company was on the cusp of something new. As Mark took the stage to deliver his keynote address, he paused for a moment, taking in the faces before him. These were the people he had worked so hard to bring together. These were the people who had given him the opportunity to create something lasting. "I'm not here to tell you what's next," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What's next is up to all of us. This isn't my vision. This is our vision. It's a vision where every one of us has the chance to grow, to lead, and to be part of something greater than ourselves." The room was silent, and then, as if on cue, the applause started. Mark smiled, overwhelmed by the moment. For the first time, he felt the weight of his journey, not as a burden, but as a triumph. As the retreat continued, Mark wandered the grounds, reflecting on everything he had accomplished. The proposal, the changes, the struggles, and the victories. It had all led him to this moment. But it wasn't just about what he had achieved. It was about what he had learned along the way. He had learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about listening. It was about understanding the needs and desires of the people around him. He had learned that success wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, and about helping others grow along with you. And, perhaps most importantly, He had learned that success was never truly achieved alone. The people who had supported him, from Lily to Caroline, to his team and the employees at every level of the company, were the true driving force behind everything he had accomplished. Together, they had created something special. As Mark stood on the edge of the retreat's outdoor patio, watching the sun set over the horizon, he felt a profound sense of peace. The challenges he had faced had been difficult, but they had been worth it. He had built something that mattered. He had built a legacy. And as he looked ahead, he knew this was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever had a moment in your life that made you realize how far you've come? What did you learn from that journey?